Hello everyone, welcome back to GraveTales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. I want you to leave a comment on where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, be sure to like and subscribe, okay? Alright, now let's get into tonight's stories. It was a Thursday morning, the kind of morning that usually slipped by without much thought. One of those ordinary stretches of time where you fall into your routine so completely that you don't even notice the hours moving. I got to work around 8:30, coffee in one hand and my worn laptop bag in the other, and I remember thinking the office felt quieter than usual. Though maybe that was just me dragging myself out of a restless night. My workplace isn't anything glamorous. It's a mid-sized office for a supply company. It's tucked in a building that has more history than character, with beige walls that have seen better decades and buzzing fluorescent lights that always seem just on the edge of burning out. My desk sits toward the back near a wide window that looks over the parking lot. Usually, the only mail I ever get is boring flyers about office safety, the occasional inter-office memo, or junk envelopes from companies trying to sell software nobody here will ever buy. That morning though, as I dropped my bag onto the floor and started peeling off my coat, I noticed an envelope sitting right in the center of my desk. It wasn't anything fancy, just a plain white envelope, a little creased on the corners like it had been handled more than once. But what struck me first was that there was no return address. My name was typed across the front, first and last, but the letters were slightly crooked, as if whoever typed it had used an old typewriter or maybe a printer that was just barely holding together. At first, I didn't think much of it sometimes. Clients sent things directly instead of through the download button. When I flipped it over and saw there was nothing else written anywhere. No postage stamp, no company logo, no smudges in handling. My stomach gave a little twist. Somebody had either dropped this off themselves or managed to sneak it into a system without anyone noticing, and I couldn't figure out which option bothered me more. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled the paper out, unfolding it carefully like I expected it to fall apart in my hands. The first thing that hit me was the smell strange, like old basements and damp paper, the kind of scent that clings to things left too long in a forgotten drawer. The letter itself was typed, just like the envelope, neat but uneven and deep. Words lined up in a way that almost made them look like a ransom note, even though all the letters were the same font. The first line made me stop breathing for a second. I've killed before. It's just that, plain and blunt, like the start of a confession nobody asked for. My heart started thudding in my chest as my eyes scanned further down, each sentence hitting harder than the last. The writer described things that made my skin crawl, not in bloody detail, not in the way you might expect from some sensational story, but in a cold, matter-of-fact way that made it somehow worse. He talked about taking lives in the late 80s and 90s, about young people who had disappeared from bus stops or while walking home from night shifts, and about how nobody had ever tied the pieces together because he had been careful. He didn't use names in the beginning, just descriptions, but I recognized some of the cases right away. Growing up in this state, I'd heard about them even years later, stories of unsolved vanishings that sometimes popped up in local news whenever anniversaries came around. And there was the woman who vanished after locking up a diner late one night. The college student last seen walking toward the library on a foggy evening. The teenager waiting at the edge of the mall parking lot for a ride that never showed. Each case had been its own mystery, whispered about, written into the back pages of newspapers, talked about in hushed tones when people mentioned how unsafe things had been back then. And here I was, sitting at my desk with a letter that connected them like pens on a corkboard, except the person holding the string was admitting it openly. I should have stopped reading, should have folded it back up and gone straight to my manager or the security office. but I didn't. Something about the way it was written held me in place. Like when you know you should look away from an accident, but your eyes won't move. The writer said he was tired of keeping secrets. He said the police had never been close to finding him, that he had been careful enough to watch their every move, even showing up at some of the crime scenes just to prove he could blend in with the onlookers. He described the feeling of being invisible, of being so close to being caught, but never touched, and how that thrill had stayed with him for decades. And then the letter shifted, like a sudden lurch in the road that knocks the air out of you. He mentioned my name, my full name, typed cleanly among the rest of the perfect lines, as though he wanted to make sure I couldn't miss it. He wrote, "You're reading this now, and I want you to understand something. You're not safe either. You'll understand soon." I felt the blood drain from my face as I sat there, the rest of the office fading out around me, the buzz of the lights suddenly louder than anything else. I reread that line over and over, wondering if it was some sick coincidence, if maybe he had picked my name at random, but it was typed so clearly, so deliberately, it didn't feel random at all. My hands were shaking when I reached the bottom of the page, where there was nothing, no signature, no initials, no hidden clue tucked into the corner. Just a final sentence that read, "This is only the beginning." I folded it back up, slower than I had unfolded it, my brain scrambling to make sense of what I was holding. At first, I thought maybe it was one of those viral marketing things, some twisted campaign for a horror movie or a crime show. But then, I thought about the cases, the ones I'd heard whispered about since I was a teenager, and how the letter mentioned things that I had never read in any article. Details about where a shoe had been left behind, or how one family never found their daughter's purse. I knew I hadn't seen those things in the news. Instead, whoever wrote this knew something they shouldn't have known, unless they really had been there. I sat there for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes, just staring at the paper in front of me and trying to calm my breathing. I looked around the office, expecting someone to pop their head over the cubicle wall and laugh, like this was some elaborate prank set up by a coworker, but no one did. People went about their day like normal, shuffling papers, typing on keyboards, making small talk about the weather. Nobody seemed to notice that my world had just tilted. I slipped the letter back into the envelope and tucked it under a folder, not sure what to do with it. Part of me wanted to run straight to the police right there, but another part of me was frozen with embarrassment, afraid of walking in there with a story that sounded too strange to be real. Who would believe that a decades-old serial killer had suddenly decided to send me a typed confession at my boring office job? Who would think it was anything more than a hoax? Still, even as I tried to convince myself it was fake, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it was deeply, horribly real. The words felt too sharp, too direct, and in the way my name was nestled in there made my skin crawl in a way that no prank ever had. I remember sitting there, forcing myself to go through the motions of the workday, answering emails and making calls, but the whole time my mind was stuck on the envelope hiding under the folder. I replayed the words over and over in my head, the ones that said, "You're not safe either." Safe from what? Safe from whom? If this was real, if this person was still alive and watching, then how long had they been keeping an eye on me? And why me, of all people? That was the question that sank its claws in the deepest twilight. When I finally got up from my desk for lunch, I slipped the envelope into my bag like it was evidence I couldn't let out of my sight. Walking down the hall, I felt eyes on me, though when I looked, no one was paying attention. The world looked the same, but I didn't feel the same. I felt like I had been chosen for something I didn't want any part of. Dragged into a story that wasn't mine, but was quickly becoming mine, whether I liked it or not. And even though I tried to tell myself it would all make sense later, then maybe it would turn out to be nothing. A part of me already knew my life had just changed in ways I couldn't yet imagine. All because of that letter, the one that started with 4 words that still echoed in my head: I've killed before. The rest of that day blurred together in a way that felt both too fast and painfully slow. Like every tick of the clock was echoing inside my chest, but the hours themselves were slipping away from me without my noticing. And all because of the letter folded neatly inside my bag. It's hidden between meaningless files and half-written reports that suddenly felt like props in someone else's play. I kept thinking about the words, replaying them over and over in my head until they felt burned into the inside of my skull. And though I tried to push them down, tried to act like everything was normal, I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, convinced someone was watching me from across the office. Though every time I looked up, it was only a coworker staring at a screen or sipping coffee, oblivious to the hurricane swirling in my stomach. At one point, I even slid the envelope back out, just to check that I hadn't imagined it. That maybe my nerves had invented something that wasn't really there. But of course, the letter was real. The same uneven lines, the same smell of old paper and dampness, said the same sentence at the end that made me feel like ice water was dripping down my spine. You're not safe either. I shoved it back into my bag quickly, but the damage was already done. I couldn't convince myself this was a prank anymore. Not when the words were sitting right there, heavy and undeniable. Still, doubt clawed at me, because that's what the mind does when something impossible happens, tries to sand down the edges until it feels explainable, till it can be fit into a box that doesn't let your world unravel. Maybe it was a cruel joke, I told myself. Maybe some obsessive true crime junkie with too much time on their hands had crafted this to scare me. After all, people get weird letters all the time, don't they? Internet forums are filled with stories of stalkers and fake threats, of creepy mail that turned out to be nothing, okay? I tried to cling to that thought, but every time I did, my brain reminded me of the details. The ones I was sure I'd never read in any newspaper: the missing purse, the misplaced shoe, the hint that he'd stood in the crowd at his own crime scenes. If someone was pranking me, they weren't just digging into the past, they were digging into places only the killer should have known. I hated that I couldn't explain it away, and I hated even more that a part of me already believed it. Deep down in the place you can't argue with, no matter how hard you try. When my shift ended, I lingered longer than I needed to, afraid to step outside alone into the parking lot, afraid that the moment I pushed open the glass doors, someone would be waiting in the shadows with that same calm certainty that dripped from the letter. Finally left when most of the others had gone, hurrying to my car with my keys clenched between my fingers like a makeshift weapon, scanning every corner, every parked vehicle, half expecting someone to lunge at me. Of course, no one did. The lot was as empty as always, the hum of the nearby road, carrying on like life had no idea mine was splintered. I drove home with one hand gripping the wheel and the other never leaving my bag, as though keeping the letter close somehow kept me in control of it. And the whole way I kept checking my rearview mirror, convinced the same black SUV had been behind me for 3 miles, maybe 5, though when I finally turned off onto my street, it kept going straight and disappeared. Inside my apartment, I locked the door, then checked it twice, then pulled the curtains tight until the city lights outside were smoke. I set the envelope down on my kitchen table and just stared at it, the plain white paper looking so ordinary and so threatening all at once. I thought about calling the police there, dialing the number and spilling everything, but the voice in my head told me it would get back that they would laugh, think that they'd shrugged it off as some attention-seeking stunt, that they'd ask me why I hadn't just thrown it away. And honestly, I wasn't sure how I'd explain myself. A serial killer sent me a confession letter with my name in it. Sounds like the start of a bad horror movie, not a police report. I poured myself a drink instead, something strong enough to burn on the way down, and sat there with the glass in one hand and the letter in the other, reading it again and again until I could almost hear the voice behind the words, calm, detached, confident. That confidence scared me the most. Whoever this was, real or fake, they weren't rambling or unhinged the way you'd expect. They were deliberate. They knew exactly what they wanted to say. Eventually, I couldn't stand staring at it anymore, so I stuffed it back in the envelope and shoved it into a drawer. Though, even as I did, I knew it wouldn't stay hidden. Letters like that don't just go away because you put them out of sight. Tried distracting myself with TV, flipping through channels without seeing any of it. Then scrolling my phone for hours without remembering a single thing I read. Every noise outside made me jump. Every creak of the building settling made me hold my breath. When I finally crawled into bed, the shadows seemed thicker than usual, stretching across the walls like they were reaching for me, and I kept glancing at the door, half expecting the knob to turn. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it dragged me through dreams that felt like warning scouts of faceless people staring at me. A man's voice whispering from the dark, and a stack of letters piling up on my desk faster than I could read them, each one with my name written sharper and darker until the ink bled. I woke up sweaty and shaky, the sheets twisted around me, my alarm buzzing in the background like nothing had changed. Like the world had no idea that I had. The next day, I did what people do when they're desperate to make sense of something. I told someone else, just to see how the words sounded when they left my mouth. At lunch, I pulled aside a coworker I trusted, someone who had always seemed grounded, the type of person who doesn't rattle easily. I slid the envelope across the table, told them to read it, and watched their face as they did. At first, they laughed, like they were waiting for the punchline, but as they kept reading, their smile faded into a frown. When they finished, they pushed it back and said, "That's messed up, but it's gotta be a joke, right? Like some creep with too much free time." They tried to laugh again, but it didn't stick, and I could tell the letter unsettled them more than they wanted to admit. Their words should have comforted, but instead, they made the pit in my stomach go deeper. If it was a joke, why? Didn't it feel like one? If it was a prank, why did it feel like a message carved straight into my life? I nodded and pretended to agree, but the moment I was alone again, the doubt came back stronger, whispering that maybe the reason it felt so real was because it was. That night, I sat in my laptop and typed in the names of the cases the letter had hinted at. The internet is a graveyard of old headlines, and sure enough, stories were still there if you dug far enough scans of yellow newspapers, guide local broadcasts, blogs run by amateur sleuths who had never let the mysteries go. Each one lined up with what the letter described. Kay, a dino worker gone missing after her shift. A college student last seen walking across campus. A teenager waiting for her ride. The details matched in ways that felt too sharp to be coincidence, and some of them matched in ways that weren't even public. One blog speculated about the missing purse, but only because it had been mentioned by the family in a brief interview decades ago. I had to dig through pages of search results to find it, but there it was, exactly as the letter said. 10 more. I read, the colder I felt, because the puzzle pieces weren't just fitting, they were snapping into place with a certainty that made my heart pound. Whoever wrote this letter wasn't inventing stories. They were drawing from a well of knowledge that only someone close to those crimes would have by midnight. My eyes burned from the screen, and my chest felt tight and dragged. I closed the laptop and sat there in the glow of the lamp, the silence of my apartment pressing in on me like a weight. The thought that kept circling my mind wasn't just that someone had confessed, it was that someone had chosen me. Out of everyone, out of all the people they could have written to, they typed my name. I didn't know if it was random or if there was some deeper reason, but the fact that I couldn't answer that question made it worse. I wasn't just a reader of the story anymore. I was part of it, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it. The letter was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness in my chest that hadn't eased overnight. The kind of pressure that makes you sit still for a long time at the edge of your bed, staring at the floor as if it holds an answer you're too scared to look for anywhere else. And though the sun was already slipping through the blinds, painting pale stripes across the room, I couldn't shake the sense that everything around me was colder, quieter, heavier, like the letter itself had changed. Yeah, I told myself that I needed to do something, anything, because pretending this was going to fade on its own felt like lying to myself. And the longer I ignored it, the more the weight in my chest grew. So I pulled my laptop onto the table, poured coffee that tasted too bitter, no matter how much sugar I stirred in, and opened a blank browser tab, my fingers hovering over the keys as if they were afraid of what they were about to drag into my sight. It started simply, enough I typed in the first name that had stuck with me from the letter. A missing woman in 1989, someone I vaguely remembered hearing about in hushed tones years ago. Though the details had always been foggy, wrapped in the kind of urban legend atmosphere that clings to old, unsolved cases. The search results popped up quickly, a handful of outdated newspaper scans, a couple of archived TV segments uploaded by someone who clearly had a fascination with local crime, and even a small memorial website with grainy photos of the woman, smiling in the way that photos from the 80s always seem to catch people, with hair teased high and hope glittering in her eyes in a way that made my chest ache. I clicked one article and began reading, and with each sentence, I felt the hair on the back of my neck prickle because the letter had been right about details I had never seen before. The woman had disappeared after her shift at a local diner, a fact I remembered. But the article mentioned something I had skimmed past in the letter and not given much thought to at the time, that her shoes had been found neatly placed under the diner's back door awning, as if she had stepped out of them deliberately or someone else had done it for her. It was the kind of detail that didn't scream importance on its own, but in the context of the letter, it became chilling, because the letter had described not only that the shoes were there, but that the police had never told the public which door they were found at, only that they were in the area. Whoever had written to me hadn't just been retelling public facts, they had been inside the story. That realization was like a spark, and it pushed me forward in a way I hadn't been ready for. So I pulled up another name from the letter. This time, a college student from the early 90s who had vanished on her way to the library. I typed her name, and again, a flood of results came up, most of them the same recycled facts, but buried deeper in message boards, threads, where amateur sleuths still debated theories late into the night. I clicked one, scrolled through arguments about boyfriends and strangers, about the possibility of abduction versus running away. And then I saw it, a single comment mentioning something strange about her missing bag. The comment claimed her roommate had once told police that the girl never went anywhere without her tote bag, the one she used to carry not just books, but practically her entire life. And yet, when the police searched the library path, they had found no sign of it, no strap, no buckle, nothing. The letter had mentioned the missing bag like it was proof of ownership, a sign the killer had held it in his hands before tossing it into a ditch miles away. Reading that comment and thinking back to the exact phrasing in the letter made my stomach twist because it was too close to be brushed off. Either the writer had scoured every corner of the internet, every obscure message board and whispered family interview, or he was telling the truth when he said he had been there. And if he was telling the truth about that, what else had he been? telling the truth about it. By the time the coffee in my mug had gone cold, I had pulled up every single case mentioned in the letter, one after another, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Each disappearance was connected by small, intimate details that had either never been released publicly or were buried so deep in obscure corners of the internet that only someone with an obsessive fixation could have unearthed them. And while obsessive fixations exist, there are people who dedicate their entire lives to solving crimes in their basements. The tone of the letter, the directness of the confession, didn't feel like obsession for its own sake. It felt like ownership. Like the writer was saying, these stories belonged to him because he had written them in blood decades earlier. I printed out some of the articles, spreading them across my table until the wood was covered in faded faces and headlines. And the more I looked at them, the more it felt like they were staring back at me. The grainy eyes were begging me not to ignore what I was holding. I traced my finger along the dates and locations. And that's when another connection started to form, one that hadn't been obvious at first glance. Most of the cases had happened within about 30 miles of each other, a rough circle that overlapped with places I knew, bus stops I had driven past without thinking, diners I had eaten in as a kid, streets I had walked down without fear. They weren't random. They were clustered, contained, almost methodical. And suddenly, the line from the letter that had haunted me most, "You're not safe either," took on a different shape as I worked, lived, and moved inside that same circle. The thought brought myself back from the table, my chair scraping against the floor loud enough to make me flinch. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain back an inch, scanning the street below like I expected to see someone waiting, but all I saw were cars parked neatly, a dog walker bundled in a coat, a delivery van pulling away. Normal life, ordinary life, but I couldn't unsee the map in my head, the circle that seemed to fold me into it, whether I wanted it or not. I closed the curtain and paced the room, my mind trying to find any excuse to explain it all away. Maybe the letter was written by one of those amateur sleuths who had pieced everything together. Maybe the mention of my name had been some cruel way of making the letter more personal. Maybe, but even as I thought it, I knew I didn't believe it. There was too much intention. In other words, too much precision. This wasn't just research. This was confession. At one point, I pulled the letter out again, holding it up against the articles as if matching the sentences word for word would unlock something I hadn't seen before. But all it did was deepen the dread. My hands shook as I held the pages, and I kept glancing at the window again, convinced that if I stared long enough, I'd catch someone watching me. Hours passed like that, lost in a cycle of reading, comparing, and staring, until the sky outside darkened into the kind of evening where streetlights glow too early, reminding me how quickly daylight slips away when you're not paying attention. I realized I hadn't eaten, hadn't showered, hadn't done anything but dig deeper into a past I wasn't sure I wanted to know. And still, I couldn't stop, because with every fact that lined up, every eerie overlap between the letter and reality, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. This was real. If the killer was out there writing to me after decades of silence, then what did it mean that he had chosen me? What did it mean that he wanted me to know? And what would happen if I kept ignoring it? By the time I finally pushed the laptop shut, my eyes aching and my throat dry, the conclusion I had been avoiding all day pressed against me with the kind of certainty you can't reason away. This wasn't a prank, and it wasn't the work of some obsessive researcher. It was real. The letter was real. The voice behind it was real. And the danger it promised wasn't just a shadow in the corner of my mind. It was moving closer. And the worst part was, I still had no idea why. I didn't sleep much after that night, and by the time the next morning rolled around, I was already on my second cup of coffee, staring at the same spot on my kitchen table where I had left a letter from the night before, my eyes burning from exhaustion, but my mind refusing to rest because the words "a warning for you" had set up shop inside my head like an echo chamber that wouldn't let me think about anything else. And even as I tried to distract myself by scrolling through emails or putting on the news, I found myself constantly drifting back to the letter, to the shaky handwriting, to the unnerving way the sentences had been pieced together, almost like the killer wanted me to know he was in control of every word he wrote. And while I wanted to tell myself it was some cruel joke, some prankster who had too much time on their hands and maybe got hold of the wrong address, the logical part of my brain kept circling back to the reality that someone had not only sent me a confession to multiple murders, but had also decided to make it personal by telling me it was a warning, and the weight of that reality pressed down heavier the longer I sat there, thinking about how something so small, just a few sheets of paper in a torn envelope could shift my entire perspective on my own safety, my own daily routine, and even my own identity in the world, because up until that moment, I was just a regular person with a regular job. Not the kind of person you'd expect to be singled out by a serial killer, not the kind of person whose life got tangled up in something dark and dangerous like this, and the strangeness of that irony stuck with me as I showered, dressed, and forced myself into my car to head to work like nothing had happened, even though everything inside of me was screaming that things had changed forever. When I walked into the office, everything looked the same. The reception desk with its fake potted plant, the smell of paper and time lingering in the air, the faint hum of computers kicking on that I felt like a stranger in a place I had worked at for years. Like suddenly everyone else was walking through a normal day while I carried around this invisible burden that I couldn't talk about. And every time I glanced at my coworkers, I wondered if I should say something, if I should warn them, or if I'd only sound like a paranoid fool talking about a letter that no one else had seen. A letter that could easily be dismissed as a hoax. And so I kept quiet, bearing the truth behind forced smiles and half-hearted small talk. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that maybe whoever sent the letter wasn't content with just dropping it in the mail. Maybe they were out there somewhere waiting for me to react. And the paranoia made me hyper-aware of every little detail, the shadow moving across the blinds, the delivery truck pulling up outside, the coworker who lingered at the copier longer than usual as the hours ticked by. My nerves only grew tighter until I finally decided that keeping this to myself wasn't going to help. And I picked up the phone during my lunch break and dialed the local police department, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained that I had received a letter that claimed to be from a serial killer, a letter that included a warning directed at me, and even though I had expected them to laugh it off, the tone on the other end of the line shifted quickly from casual politeness to professional concern. And within an hour, 2 detectives showed up at my office, their presence drawing curious stares from my coworkers as they guided me into a side room for privacy. Sitting there across from them, I felt the weight of the moment sink in deeper as I handed over the envelope and tried to recount everything I could remember the way the handwriting looked. The tone of the words, the exact phrasing of the warning note. They listened without interrupting, their eyes scanning the pages carefully, their expressions betraying very little, though I could see in the slight tightening of their jaws and the quiet exchange of glances between them that this wasn't something they could just brush aside. And when one of them finally spoke, he asked me if I had any enemies, anyone who might want to scare me, and though I shook my head, insisting that my life was painfully ordinary, that I couldn't think of a single person who would go this far to rattle me, but didn't look convinced, and I realized then that in their eyes, I wasn't just a victim of some anonymous letter writer, was now a potential target in an ongoing case, and that thought made my skin crawl. They took the letter with them, promising to analyze it for fingerprints and DNA, but they also warned me to be careful, to pay attention to my surroundings. and as I walked him out of the building, I couldn't help but feel like I had just stepped onto a path I couldn't turn back from. Like no matter what happened next, my life had been claimed by this mystery, tied up in a story I didn't want to be part of. And when I drove home later that evening, I caught myself checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, convinced that the car behind me was following too closely, but the man walking down the sidewalk had turned his head a little too long in my direction. That the shadow at the end of my street seemed to move when it shouldn't have, and the fear gnawed at me until I was back inside with the doors locked, my curtains drawn, and my heart pounding in my chest like I was waiting for someone to knock at any second. That night, I sat at my desk trying to work, trying to write emails, but every sound outside sent my imagination spiraling. And when the phone rang unexpectedly, I nearly jumped out of my skin, only to realize it was just a telemarketer. But even that small event hammered home how on edge I had become, how much that letter had taken root in my life in less than 24 hours. And as I stared out the window into the dark street, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe the warning wasn't just about what he had done to others. Maybe it was a promise of what he planned to do to me. The next few days after receiving the second letter stretched out like some surreal dream. Kind where every sound seems too sharp, every shadow seems too heavy, and in your own body feels like it doesn't quite belong to you. And I think that was the hardest part, the way the world around me carried on like nothing had changed on its own. My head, everything was screaming that I was in danger, that someone was watching me, and that no one would believe me until it was too late. Because every morning when I woke up, I would check the blinds and the locks, staring out onto the street, expecting to catch someone there, but the sidewalks were always empty. And yet, that didn't bring relief, because the letters proved that he was real, and that he was out there, and that, for some reason, he had chosen me to send these confessions to. And what made it worse was that the police still hadn't followed up with anything useful. All they kept saying was that they were looking into it and keeping an eye on the situation, which sounded more like stall tactics than actual protection. So I started keeping a notebook of my own, jotting down every strange detail, every unfamiliar car that parked near my apartment, every phone call with no caller ID that cut off when I answered, every time I thought I saw movement from the corner of my eye near the tree line behind the parking lot, because I needed some report of what was happening to me, just in case I ended up disappearing like the victims he described in his letters. And speaking of those victims, I had reread the descriptions 100 times, trying to figure out if there was some hidden connection between them and me, some detail that explained why I was receiving these letters. But all I kept circling back to was the way he lingered in describing their routines, how they always seemed ordinary at first, until he twisted it into a countdown, like she walked the same path home every day, until one day I was there, or he liked to leave his back door unlocked in the evening, and one night it was my hand that turned the knob. And it made me paranoid about my own routine, how predictable I probably looked when I left work at the same time each evening, how easy it would be for someone to learn that I always stopped at the same gas station, that I usually ordered the same coffee. And I started trying to break that pattern, but even when I tried to mix things up, it felt like it was already too late, like he already knew everything about me. And that feeling grew worse one morning when I opened my mailbox and found a third envelope, smaller than the others, with my name typed in block letters on the front, and inside there wasn't a long letter this time, but just a single folded piece of paper with one sentence on it, typed in the same font, and it read, "Don't bother changing your routine." I already like the way it is, and I swear my blood went cold, because it meant he had noticed. It meant he knew I was trying to break my habits, and it meant he was close enough to watch me, maybe even close enough to write the letter after seeing me the day before, which sent me spiraling into a panic that left me pacing my apartment for hours, checking every corner, opening every closet, pulling back the shower curtain just to be sure no one was standing there, and I ended up calling my friend Mark, who I hadn't told about any of this yet because I didn't want to sound crazy. But I was desperate, and I broke down and told him everything about the letters, about the descriptions of the murders, about the line that suggested the killer was watching me. And at first, he was skeptical, saying it sounded like some sick prank. But when I read him the exact lines from the letters, he went quiet, and then he said, "Hey, I need to get out of that place for a while," and he offered to let me stay at his house, which was across town, and I almost said yes on the spot. But then this paranoia gripped me again, this thought that maybe leaving my apartment would just make it easier for him to get me alone on the road. And so, instead, I told Mark I'd think about it, and I spent the night sitting in a chair near the front door with a baseball bat, not even trying to sleep, just listening, waiting. And that was when something happened that I still can't explain, because around 3 in the morning, as I sat there in the dark, I heard someone whisper my name, clear as day, from the other side of the front door. Just a soft voice that said my name like they were trying it out, and I froze, clutching the bat so hard my knuckles hurt. And I didn't move or make a sound, just sat there, straining to hear, and after a few seconds of silence, I told myself it must have been my imagination, that maybe I was half asleep and dreaming with my eyes open. And then I heard it again, faint but deliberate. And the second time, it was followed by the softest laugh, like someone was trying not to wake the neighbors, and I stayed in that chair until the sun came out, too scared to even look through the peephole because I was terrified what I might see looking back at me. And when the morning light finally came, I opened the door to check, and there was nothing there. No footprints. No signs that anyone had stood outside. But I know what I heard. And I think it was his way of reminding me that he could get close anytime he wanted. That the letters weren't just words, that he was right there. And in that moment, I started to understand that this wasn't just about me receiving his confession. This was about control. About him pulling me into his world. About him making me feel the same helplessness his victims must have felt in their final days. And the worst part was that it was working. Because even as I tried to keep myself together, I felt like I was unraveling, like my life wasn't mine anymore but his. And I knew deep down that if I didn't find some way to fight back, I was going to end up as one more name in his list of stories, written down in a future letter to someone else. The next few days after receiving the second letter felt like being trapped in a fog, where reality no longer felt like it had solid edges. Like I was walking through my life, but every step I took was softened by the fear that something unseen was moving just beyond the corners of my vision. And while I tried to hold myself together at work and at home, pretending like everything was fine for the sake of keeping myself sane, the truth was that my mind was breaking apart into fragments of fear and suspicion, constantly circling back to the words on the page, the handwriting that looked like it had been pressed with more force than necessary, as though the author had been shaken while writing, and the constant reminder that the warning was meant for me, specifically me, not anyone else in the office, not my boss or my coworkers, but me. Like I had been chosen or singled out in a way that left me feeling marked. It's like a spotlight had been shown on me, and I couldn't find a way to step out of it, no matter how hard I tried. And each night, when I laid in bed, I kept wondering if the creaks in the hallway were just the house settling, or if someone was really standing just beyond the door, waiting for me to drift off so they could step closer. And it got so bad that I started keeping the lights on all night. Though that didn't help much, because the shadows that clung to the corners of the room seemed even darker, and I could see them constantly. And I realized I was wearing myself down to the bone, barely sleeping, living on caffeine and nerves. Until one morning, I came into the office and saw another envelope waiting on my desk, and I nearly screamed right there in front of everyone. though I managed to hold it in, sliding the envelope under a stack of papers like I was hiding something. Shameful, and when I finally opened it later that day in the bathroom stall with my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the paper. What I found inside made my stomach flip because it wasn't just another letter. It was a photocopy of a newspaper clipping from years ago, the headline announcing the discovery of a body in an alley downtown. A case I dimly remembered hearing about, but couldn't recall the details of, and on the margin of the clipping, written in that same jagged handwriting, were the words, "This one was almost you." And I don't think I've ever felt such an immediate rush of heat and cold through my body. It's because, for the first time, I realized that whoever this person was, they had been close to me before. Close enough that they could have acted close. Enough that I had somehow avoided being the victim. And that thought made my vision blur as I sat there on the toilet seat clutching the paper. Because it wasn't just about threats or confessions anymore. It was about the idea that my name could have been in that headline. My picture could have been on the news. My body could have been the one zipped into a bag. And when I tried to imagine what that alley must have looked like, the smell, the silence, the way the police must have stood around trying to piece together what had happened, I realized that somewhere in the background of all of that was the person who was now writing to me, the killer himself, watching and remembering, and the thought made me nauseous. I didn't tell anyone about the clipping, not right away, because by then I had convinced myself that if I went to the police with it, they wouldn't believe me. They'd think I was some paranoid nutjob who printed it out myself, especially since the envelope had no return address and no fingerprints, at least none I could see. And worse, the killer had written something at the bottom of the letter, almost like a personal note. "If you share this, I'll know," which felt less like a warning and more like a certainty. Like he already had eyes on me, already knew how I was reacting to each letter and the paranoia that line created inside. Me was worse than anything else, because how could he know unless he was close, unless he was nearby, unless maybe he was someone I saw every day without realizing it, maybe a coworker who walked past my cubicle with a polite smile, maybe a neighbor I waved to when taking the trash out, maybe the guy at the gas station who rang me up with a nod. And once that thought took root in my mind, it started growing like a weed, choking out everything else, because suddenly everyone I saw became a suspect. Every friendly gesture looked like a mask. Every casual conversation felt like a test to see if I would slip up. And I hated myself for thinking that way, but I couldn't help it. Not when I had proof in my pocket that someone out there wanted. Need to know how close I had come to being nothing more than a memory. That night, I drank too much, sitting in the dim glow of my living room lamp with the newspaper clipping spread out in front of me, trying to convince myself it didn't mean what it clearly meant. But the more I stared at the grainy black and white photo of the crime scene, the more I swore I could see something just beyond the frame, like a shadow that wasn't supposed to be there, like maybe the killer had been captured accidentally in the photograph. And even though I knew that was just my imagination twisting reality, the idea wouldn't let me go. And it left me wondering if maybe all the answers I needed were already hidden in plain sight. If only I knew where to look. I thought about calling my brother, telling him everything, asking him to come stay with me for a while. But then I remembered the way the killer's note had ended. The promise that he'd know if I shared, and I couldn't take the chance of dragging someone else into it, not when the warning felt so sharp and personal. So, instead, I sat alone with my fear, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional whoosh of cars passing by outside. And I kept wondering if maybe one of those cars had him inside, parked on the curb, watching the glow from my window, waiting for me to make the wrong move. And by then, I was too far gone into paranoia to stop myself from checking the locks again. And again, even though I knew deep down that a locked door wouldn't stop him if he really wanted to get in. The letter hadn't just shaken me. It had broken something inside me, some fragile trust I'd had in the safety of my own routines. And from that point forward, every sound, every shadow, every stranger became part of a puzzle I didn't know how to solve, and all I could do was wait for the next letter, wait for the next clue, wait for the moment when my name would finally be the one written in the paper. And the longer I waited, the more I started to believe that maybe that was the point of all this. Maybe the killer didn't just want me dead. Maybe he wanted me to know it was coming, to feel it in my bones before it happened, to rot from the inside out with fear until the moment finally arrived. And as much as I wanted to believe I could fight it, the truth was I was already halfway there, already unraveling, already living in the world he had created for me, a world where nothing was safe and nowhere was home anymore. The next few days after the second letter arrived were some of the longest days of my life, and I can say without exaggeration that each minute felt stretched and warped, like I was caught in some strange limbo between dread and disbelief, because while part of me wanted to push the whole thing out of my head and convince myself this was just some elaborate prank or a mistaken delivery, another part of me couldn't shake the way my stomach dropped every time I saw the words staring back at me, words that flashed around, words that knew me, and worst of all, words that warned me of something waiting just out of sight. And the feeling that I wasn't alone lingered constantly, like a shadow glued to my back, no matter what time of day it was. I didn't tell anyone at work about the second letter, because the first time I did, my coworkers had laughed it off and made jokes about secret admirers and pen pals. And I didn't want to put myself in that position again, but it weighed on me, especially since the new letter wasn't just quasi-confessions about past murders, but instead included something different details that felt directed only at me, like the killer knew exactly where I'd been and what I was doing, because one line read, "You shouldn't walk home so late at night. I saw you take the alley again," and when I read that, the blood drained from my face. My skin turned cold, because just 2 nights before, I had walked home late after finishing paperwork at the office, cutting through the narrow alley near the back of the bakery, an alleyway I'd never mentioned to anyone, a shortcut I used only when I was too tired to take the long way, and the realization that someone had been watching close enough to describe. It made me feel like I was walking around with a target pinned to me. I couldn't sleep that night, and I ended up pulling the curtains tight across every window, checking the locks 3, 4, sometimes 5 times, pacing back and forth with the letter in my hand, reading the same sentence again and again until it was burned into my brain. And I kept asking myself how this person knew me, why they chose me, what they wanted, and the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the letters weren't random at all, but something deliberate, a sick game where I had been chosen to be the only audience. The next morning, I decided to bring the letters to the police. Even though I was nervous, they'd dismiss me, but at least it would be on record. And I thought maybe they'd connect it to something bigger, maybe link it to a case. And as I walked into the precinct, the stale smell of coffee and old paper filled the air. The kind of smell that clung to the walls of places where people spent too much of their lives. And I explained everything to the officer at the desk, handing over the letters like they were toxic, like I didn't want them in my hands anymore. And the officer skimmed them before raising an eyebrow and saying he'd pass them on to a detective. But I could tell from the tone in his voice that he didn't take it as seriously as I did, because he asked if I had an ex who liked to write, or if maybe it was some kind of prank from someone at work. And I wanted to shout at him, tell him no, this was real. This was someone who confessed to murder. But I kept calm and asked if I could speak directly to a detective. Eventually, after waiting for nearly an hour, I met with Detective Alvarez, a tired-looking man with bags under his eyes. someone who seemed perpetually worn down by the job. And I placed the letters in front of him, watching as he read every word carefully, and his face stayed blank, except for a tiny twitch in his jaw when he reached the part about the eye. And I could tell that detail struck him too. Maybe gave the letter more weight than just a hoax. And when he finally looked up, he asked me questions about my daily routines, if I'd noticed anyone following me, if anyone at work had reason to mess with me, and I answered everything honestly, though the truth was I hadn't seen anyone, not directly at least, only the creeping sensation of eyes on me in the dark, which I admitted sounded paranoid, but he nodded like he'd heard it before from other people in similar situations. He told me not to walk home alone at night, to vary my routines, and that they'd analyze the letters for fingerprints and handwriting comparisons. Until then, there wasn't much they could do, which left me with an uneasy feeling, like I'd just dumped all of my fear into his lap, and he had handed it right back. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that if the letters were real, the person behind them was really a killer, then they weren't just confessing. They were circling me like prey. And I couldn't help but imagine them lurking in the shadows outside my apartment, waiting for the right moment. And even though I double-locked the door and pushed a chair under the handle like some kind of makeshift barricade, sleep still came in short, shallow bursts. And every creak of the building made me jolt awake, convinced someone was breaking in. Days passed without another letter, and just when I thought maybe it was over, maybe the police presence had scared whoever it was away, a third letter arrived, slipped into the stack of work mail like nothing was unusual, and when I opened it, my chest tightened because it wasn't just a confession this time, and it was a direct message. I know you went to the police. They can't help you. I can see you right now. That one sentence nearly knocked the breath out of me because I was sitting in my office, blinds half open, and the thought that someone might be standing outside, looking in, sent a jolt of pure panic through me. I jumped up and yanked the blinds shut, my hands shaking so badly the cord slipped from my grip twice. And then I pressed my back to the wall, heart pounding, trying to steady my breathing. How could they know? Had someone followed me to the station? Were they outside watching me as I sat there with the letter in my hands? I couldn't focus on work after that, couldn't focus on anything. Shoved the letter into my bag, left early without even saying goodbye to anyone, and went straight home, pulling my hoodie up as if that would somehow make me invisible. I called Detective Alvarez that evening, telling him about the new letter, and his voice was calm but firm this time, asking me to bring it in immediately, and when I did, he scanned it quickly, lips pressed tight, and said, "They're escalating." That word stuck with me, escalating. It meant this wasn't random. This wasn't something that would just stop. It meant it was getting worse. Alvarez asked if I had somewhere else to stay, maybe with family or friends, at least until they figured out more. But I didn't want to uproot my life, didn't want to admit how scared I really was. So I told him I'd think about it, though in truth, I had no family nearby and no close friends I could crash with. When I left the precinct that night, the air felt heavier, the shadows deepened, and every step home felt like I was walking into a tunnel. I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, hidden just out of sight, someone was smiling, waiting, enjoying the fear that now consumed every part of my life. And yet, even in the middle of all that dread, another thought kept gnawing at me, one that I didn't want to admit out loud, but it echoed in my head nonetheless. What if these letters weren't just about threatening me? What if the killer was trying to confess because they wanted me to understand, wanted me to know their story, wanted me to play some role I hadn't chosen but couldn't escape? And if that was true, then what was I to them? A witness, a confidant, or the next name they would write down as part of their confession? When I think back to those days after the second letter arrived, I realized I was already slipping into a mindset I never thought I'd know. Because when you live your life in a routine of work, sleep, errands, and quiet nights at home, you don't. Imagine a serial killer will suddenly intrude and plant himself in your daily rhythm. But after holding those envelopes, words written in an uneven, almost feverish scrawl, I couldn't help but feel like every corner of my life had been claimed by something dark, and it was strangling me without ever showing its face. The police, of course, were heavily involved now, but their involvement only meant more questions, more sleepless nights, and more moments where I felt my own sanity being chipped away, because every time I answered one detective's question, I had 10 more questions of my own, and none of them ever had answers. Not real ones anyway, just speculation and warnings that felt more like vague threats. I remember one detective sitting in my kitchen, sipping the coffee I had poured him with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and he said, "We're treating this very seriously. But you need to understand something. These letters aren't just random. They're not a prank. Whoever is writing to you, they're deliberate and they want you scared. They want you thinking about them because that's part of their control." And I sat there, staring at the steam rising off my own untouched mug, wondering why me? Why had I been singled out? Because I wasn't doing what important. I wasn't famous. I didn't have some big reputation. I was just an office worker living alone. So why had the letters come to my desk and not someone else's? But every time I asked, the detectives would only shrug, saying things like, "Maybe. It's random. Maybe it's not." Sometimes these people just pick someone who fits their fixation. And those vague words rattled around in my head. During those endless nights where the shadows of my apartment stretched across the walls in ways that made me wonder if I was even alone anymore, I took to checking my locks 3, sometimes 4 times before bed, pressing my palms against the deadbolt to reassure myself it was really turned. Sliding a chair beneath the doorknob, like I'd seen in movies, even though I knew that wouldn't. Stopped someone determined enough, and I left the TV on just for background noise. But even the chatter of sitcom laugh tracks didn't drown out the sound of paper rustling when I reread those letters for the 100th time, scouring each sentence for hidden meaning, for something I might have missed that could explain why my life had been chosen to become a battleground between me and someone who, according to the detective, had already taken lives. That was the part that truly began eating away at meaning these weren't just idle threats. Knowing the letters weren't the ramblings of some attention seeker, okay, but the genuine words of a killer who had already proven his will by leaving victims behind. And now, for some reason, he had decided I was important enough to communicate with, maybe even stalk, maybe even claim. And though the detectives promised they had eyes on me, that didn't mean much, and I was home alone with no squad car parked. Outside, no partner to keep me company, and only my thoughts for protection. Because when you're left alone in the dark with this kind of fear, it grows into something unbearable. The second letter was worse than the first, not just because of its tone, which was somehow colder, sharper, but because it included details that I couldn't ignore, things about my own life that I never thought a stranger should know. And when I read that single sentence, I saw you stop at the store on Wednesday. You bought bread, orange juice, and paper towels. You looked tired. You should rest more. My blood turned to ice, because that was exactly what I had done on Wednesday. Just a simple after-work stop at the corner store. But the idea that someone had been close enough to watch me, to note the items in my basket, to see the way I looked under those fluorescent lights was so intimate and horrifying that I felt nauseous, like the ground had tilted under me, because it meant this wasn't just some distant figure writing from the safety of another city. No, this person had been near me, maybe only feet away, watching me when I had no idea, blending in with the other shoppers, and now replaying that memory made me sick, because every face in that store could have been his. Every man who passed by could have been looking at it, not with casual indifference, but with predatory fascination. And knowing that he had chosen to reveal that detail meant he wanted me to know how close he had been, how easily he could have done something, how easily he could have taken me then and there, but hadn't, as if to prove that he was in control, that my life was a game board, and I was just a piece moving wherever he allowed. The police officer sitting across from me that day grew very quiet when he read that line, and I saw something pass across his face, a look of discomfort that told me even he didn't know what to say, and in that silence I realized that I was more alone than ever, because while they were investigating, I was the one being lived through. I was the one lying awake at night. I was the one afraid to open my blinds in case someone was standing across the street staring up at my window, and all the while I had to keep showing up to work, sitting at my desk like everything was normal, even though every creak of the office floorboards made me wonder if another envelope was sliding toward me, another message waiting with words that would dig under my skin and leave me unable to breathe. My coworkers noticed my change, of course, sparing to each other when they thought I wasn't listening, their eyes darting toward me with pity or suspicion, but I couldn't tell them the truth, not really, not without violating the police's instructions to keep the investigation moving. And so I carried that heavy secret alone, a ticking bomb in my chest, waiting for the moment the next letter would come, because deep down I already knew there would be more, and that realization made it impossible to feel safe anywhere, not in my office, not at the store, not even in my own bed, because he had shown me he could reach me anywhere, and that knowledge was enough to shatter the fragile sense of reality I'd been holding on to. The next morning, I woke with a kind of exhaustion that wasn't from lack of sleep, but from the weight of everything that had been piling up on me since that first letter arrived at my office, and as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, I realized that the sound of silence in my apartment wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if I opened my door, there might be something or someone standing there waiting for me. But I forced myself to get up, to shower, to get dressed, to move through the motions of a normal day, even though there was nothing normal left in my life. And when I went into the kitchen to make coffee, my eyes landed on a stack of papers I had left on the counter from the night before the police notes, the copies of the confession letter, my own scribbles of theories and timelines, and I realized I was obsessive. Then maybe this was exactly what the writer of the letters wanted, for me to be consumed, for me to become part of the story instead of just a witness. And yet, even as I told myself that, I knew I couldn't stop. It's because ignoring it felt like leaving the door unlocked when I knew a killer was nearby. So I sat down, sipping my coffee, staring at the words again, trying to find something I had missed. The handwriting haunted NYT wasn't perfect. It wasn't neat, but it wasn't sloppy either. It was careful in a way, deliberate, almost like every stroke of the pen was done with control. And that made me think about control itself, about what kind of person could commit the things described in those letters and then send them to me with warnings mixed in. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I wasn't being threatened in the way most people would think, but that I was being groomed somehow, pulled into the narrative, made to see things from his point of view, and that terrified me more than anything else, because it meant he wasn't just killing for the sake of killing. He was performing, writing, documenting, and now sharing with me like I was some kind of confidant, some unwilling partner. And what if that meant he was planning for me to carry his story forward, to make sure it lived beyond him? The thought stuck with me as I drove to work. The road strangely empty for a weekday morning, and when I arrived at the office, the nerves spiked at the sight of a plain white envelope sitting on my desk like a waiting predator. No postage stamp. This time, no markings, just my name scrawled across the front in the same sharp, deliberate handwriting I had memorized, and my chest tightened as I picked it up, because that meant someone had come inside the building, had walked past the front desk, or slipped in unnoticed just to put this on my desk, and the idea that they had been here near me, maybe even watching me from a corner, sent a shiver down my spine, so strong I had to steady myself before I tore the envelope open. The letter inside was longer this time, and as my eyes raced across the lines, I felt my blood run cold. You're learning, I can tell. You're starting to see me the way I want to be seen, but you're still blind to the truth. I was there last night, closer than you think. You didn't see me, but I saw you, sitting there with your papers, sipping your coffee. You keep asking why I chose you. Maybe you should start asking what makes you different from the others. Don't go to the police again. They won't protect you. They'll only make it worse. You want to survive. Listen to me. Pay attention. The next message will come sooner than you expect. I read the words over and over again, my hands shaking so badly the paper nearly slipped from my grip, and my mind screamed at me that he had been in my apartment, that somehow, some way, he had been close enough to see me the night before, and my stomach turned with the thought of how easily he could have ended everything right then, but he hadn't, and that meant he was keeping me alive on purpose. And the question that tore at me was why. I stuffed the letter into my bag, too scared to show it to anyone at the office, because now it felt like the killer was watching every move I made. And if he was serious about punishing me for involving the police, I couldn't risk it again. Not yet. Not until I understood more. And so I went through the motions of my workday with a fake smile, nodding through conversations, staring at my computer screen without absorbing a single thing, all the while thinking about the line, what makes you different from the others? The words echoed in my mind like a riddle, like the answer was important, like maybe finding it could change everything. But the harder I tried to figure it out, the less sense it made, because I wasn't special. I wasn't someone who belonged. In a horror story or a true crime documentary, I was just me, and yet somehow that wasn't the truth in his eyes. By the time I left the office that evening, I felt like I was being pulled in two directions at once. One part of me screaming to run, to get out of the city, to leave everything behind, and another part whispering that I couldn't leave, that I had to see this through, that if I didn't, someone else would die because of my silence. And as I drove home, every pair of headlights behind me felt like they lingered too long. Every pedestrian on the sidewalk looked like they might be watching me, and when I finally pulled into the parking lot of my building, I sat in the car for almost 10 minutes, staring at the entrance, summoning the courage to go inside. The halls felt darker than usual, the elevator ride too slow, and when I reached my apartment door, my hand hesitated on the knob, wondering if he had been inside again, if he was still inside, waiting. But when I opened the door, the apartment looked the same though. That meant nothing, because someone careful enough to slip a letter onto my desk would be careful enough to hide their presence in my home. I locked the door, checked every corner, every closet, even under the bed. And though I found nothing, the paranoia had settled into me like a second skin, and I knew sleep wouldn't come easy again. Instead, I sat at the table, the letter spread in front of me, and I forced myself to read it slowly, line by line, like maybe hidden between the words, there was a clue, something he had let slip without realizing it. And as I studied the way he wrote about seeing me, about choosing me, I realized something. This wasn't random. He hadn't just plucked my name from a phone book or stumbled onto me by chance. There was a reason he knew who I was, a reason he had singled me out, and if I could figure out that reason, maybe I could get ahead of him. But the longer I stared, the heavier the words became until exhaustion finally dragged me to bed. Though I didn't so much sleep as drift in and out of shallow dreams filled with shadows at the foot of my bed, whispers in my ear and the scratch of pen against paper. When I woke again, the sun was just beginning to rise, the sky washed in pale gray, and for a brief second, I thought maybe it had all been a nightmare. But then my eyes landed on the letter, still live on the table, and I knew there was no escape. Not yet. Not until I understood what game I'd been pulled into weighing, whether I was meant to survive it. The days that followed the latest letter were some of the most torturous I had ever experienced, because by that point, fear had burrowed into every corner of my life, infecting even the smallest routines and making me question everything I once considered safe or ordinary. And it wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was a kind of constant vigilance that made even simple tasks feel like an ordeal, because I had begun to notice patterns I hadn't before. The way certain cars would slow as they passed my apartment building. The way strangers would glance for just a moment too long at me in the elevator or at the corner store. And every time I thought I saw something, my mind would immediately snap to the worst case scenario, wondering if that person was him, the killer who had now made my life a waking nightmare. And I couldn't turn off the thought that he was learning everything about me, learning my habits, my weaknesses, and planning his moves with a precision that I couldn't compete with. And yet, at the same time, there was a twisted sense of curiosity that forced me to keep reading the letters over and over, as if by memorizing them, I could somehow anticipate his next step and maybe convince myself that I understood him enough to survive. Though in reality, I was only digging myself deeper into a mental labyrinth I couldn't escape from, because every word he wrote seemed to claw at me to draw me further into his mind. And the thought that he had watched me on that Wednesday at the store still sent shivers down my spine whenever I closed my eyes, imagining his eyes on me while I picked up a loaf of bread or a carton of orange juice, and the realization that he could be anywhere, right now, studying me again, made my skin crawl and my heart race. The police had stepped up their involvement somewhat, sending an officer on my apartment periodically to check in. And Detective Alvarez had been in regular contact, but even with their presence, I never felt safe, because the letters had proven that the killer wasn't just a physical threat. He was psychological, and that meant no amount of patrol cars or locked doors could protect me from what he was doing inside my mind. And when I tried to explain this to Alvarez, he nodded solemnly and said, "We understand, but there's only so much we can do." The letters themselves are evidence, but tracking him based on what he writes is tricky. It's careful. He's thinking 3 steps ahead. And those words made my chest tighten, because thinking 3 steps ahead meant I could never relax, never let my guard down, never feel normal. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized my life had become a series of calculated moves just to survive. And even then, survival felt uncertain. Every morning, I would plan a new route to work, change the time I left, sometimes even drive instead of walking, but each variation came with its own anxiety. Because while I was trying to be unpredictable, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always a step ahead, that somehow, somewhere, he knew my next move. And that was the most terrifying part. He wasn't just observing. He was anticipating, and that made him untouchable in ways I couldn't understand. The letters themselves became increasingly personal, no longer just confessions of past crimes, but almost like a diary addressed to me, describing my life in ways that made it impossible to ignore, mentioning things I hadn't told anyone, noting my habits, my preferences, my fears, and I couldn't understand how he could know, because I had never spoken to him, had never invited him into my life, and yet the way he wrote, it was intimate, like he had been living inside my head for months, even years. And the longer I read, the more it felt like my privacy had been ripped away, leaving me exposed in ways that made every glance over my shoulder feel justified. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky was painted with bruised shades of purple and red, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by notes, letters, newspaper clippings, and my own scribbled observations, trying to make sense of it all, trying to create a map of what had happened, who he was, why he had chosen me, and in the middle of that chaos, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, and my stomach plummeted because I knew instinctively that it wasn't random, it was him. And when I opened the message, it was just a single line: "You're thinking too hard. Stop, or it will make it worse." The simplicity of the message was terrifying because it carried the weight of someone who knew exactly how to manipulate fear. Someone who understood that the mind could be as much a prison as a physical space, and it left me frozen for minutes, staring at the screen, heart pounding, hands trembling, wondering what would happen if I ignored it or if I complied, because compliance felt like surrender, but ignoring it felt like a guarantee of punishment. And that night, I barely slept, drifting in and out of consciousness while imagining shadows. In my apartment, the sound of pen scratching against paper, the famous footsteps in the hall, and every time I dozed off, I dreamed of letters stacked on my desk, each one containing more secrets, more knowledge of my life, more reminders of how vulnerable I was. The next morning, I found another envelope at my work desk. This one sealed with black tape in a way that made it impossible to open without tearing. And when I finally got it open, contents made me feel like my world had tilted on its axis. Photographs of me taken over the last several days. Some of them candid, some clearly taken while I was unaware, all of them marked with small notes in the corner. Details only someone observing me closely could know, like the fact that I've always done my coffee with my left hand, or the way my hair fell over my shoulder when I read, or the small freckle on the back of my neck band. The photos themselves weren't enough to shock me. It was the implication that he had been following me, waiting, documenting, studying, preparing for something I couldn't even imagine, okay? And as I stared at the pictures, the reality set in that this wasn't just about letters or threats, okay? This was a campaign, a deliberate effort to break me down, to make me live in a constant state of fear, and the thought that he had spent so much time planning, so much energy on me, made my skin crawl with a mixture of horror and disbelief. I called Detective Alvarez immediately, my voice barely above a whisper as I described what I had found, and he asked me to send pictures of the envelopes and the notes, promising that the police would intensify surveillance, that they would find a lead, that they would do everything they could, but deep down, I knew the letters themselves were proof of his power, because even the best surveillance couldn't undo the mental hold he had over me, couldn't erase the images from my mind, couldn't stop me from feeling hunted every second of the day. That night, I stayed awake until the early hours of the morning. Lights on, blinds closed, phone charged, and within reach. Bat in hand, in every creak, every distant noise. Every shadow made my heart leap into my throat because the fear had settled into my bones and refused to leave. And as dawn crept in, I realized something terrible. Even if he were caught tomorrow, even if the police identified him and locked him away, the psychological damage was already done. The knowledge that someone had watched me, that someone had studied me with such precision, that someone had communicated with me directly in a way that demonstrated complete control would stay with me forever. And I began to understand that the letters were never just about immediate threats. They were about proving that he could reach inside my mind, and that realization was worse than any physical attack, worse than any act of violence, because he had already won, at least in part, by making me live in terror. And that terror would not end when the police got involved. It would only evolve, growing in the silence, growing in the spaces between my thoughts, growing until I felt I had no escape, no sanctuary, and no way to reclaim the ordinary life I had once known. And as I sat in the dim glow of my living room, staring at the latest envelope on my table, I understood that I had entered a new reality, one where fear was constant, where survival required hypervigilance, and where every small action had to be calculated. because the person behind the letters wasn't just a killer. He was a master of manipulation, and my only hope was to stay one step ahead, even though I had no idea how that was possible, and even though deep down I feared that one day I wouldn't be able to. And when I finally closed my eyes that morning, it wasn't sleep that came. It was an uneasy, restless awareness that I was being watched, that the letters would continue, that the next move in this twisted game would be mine to survive or to fail. After the photographs arrived, it felt like I was unraveling in ways I couldn't even begin to describe. It's because it wasn't just the fact that someone had followed me, served me, and recorded my movements in painstaking detailing. It's that the person had done it without me noticing, without leaving any trace, without a single clue that would have allowed me to defend myself. And the thought that someone could get that close to me and remain invisible shook me to my core, because it meant that my apartment, my office, my walk to the store, even the hallways of my building were no longer my own. They belonged to him. And the knowledge that he could intrude so thoroughly left me sleepless for days, pacing from room to room, checking windows, doors, locks, closets, even under the furniture. But every time I convinced myself I had seen nothing and found nothing, the fear only grew, because I knew that seeing nothing didn't mean he wasn't there. It just meant he was careful, calculated, patient, and that was worse than a direct confrontation, because patience implied intent, planning, and a certainty that he could strike at any time. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that he wasn't just after me. He was orchestrating a campaign, one in which I was both target and audience, both prey and participant, and the weight of that realization crushed me, because it meant that survival was not just about physical safety, it was about mental endurance, about maintaining some semblance of calm in the face of someone who had studied every detail of my life and could predict my reactions. And even though the police were involved, even though Detective Alvarez assured me they were working tirelessly to find leads, the letters themselves proved that he was always one step ahead, because he could strike psychologically in ways that they couldn't prevent, could infiltrate my thoughts, my daily routines, my sleep. And for the first time, I understood that even in captivity or behind bars, someone like this could still haunt a person, could still wield power over them simply by proving how deeply they could penetrate a life that once felt safe. And I could feel that power every time I glanced at the latest envelope sitting on my kitchen counter, staring at me as though it were alive, waiting for me to open it, waiting for the moment when it could pull me into a state of panic so intense that I could barely function. And that morning, when I finally worked up the courage to open it, my stomach turned to ice, because inside were even more photographs, some taken outside my apartment building, some of my car as I left for work, and a small slip of paper folded into the stack with a single line scrawled in that jagged, deliberate handwriting. "You can't hide. You belong to this man." I read it over and over, my hands trembling so badly that the coffee I had poured minutes before sloshed onto the counter. And I realized that the words were not just a threat, they were a declaration, a statement of control. And the more I read them, the more I felt the air in the apartment grow heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were pressing in. And I couldn't help but glance at every corner of the room, every shadow, convinced that even now he could be here, observing, waiting, learning, documenting, because by now the pattern was clear. Every letter, every photograph, every detail was designed to remind me that I was never alone, that he was always close, always calculating, always planning the next move. And that realization made me nauseous, made my body ache with tension, made sleep impossible, because even in the quiet hours of the night, I imagined his presence, imagined the subtle movements of someone who had infiltrated my life with surgical precision. And I knew that if I closed my eyes too long, he would be there, just beyond. The veil of consciousness reminded me that I could not escape, that I could not rest, that survival was a constant struggle and that every breath, every glance, every step I took was observed and noted for some purpose I could not yet comprehend. I called Detective Alvarez that morning, my voice cracking as I explained the photographs, the message, the absolute certainty that this person had followed me, watched me, documented me in ways that no stranger should have known about, and he promised increased surveillance, promised that officers would monitor areas I frequented, promised that they would track suspicious vehicles and faces, promised reassurance that sounded hollow to my ears, because even if they were physically present, even if someone was watching from a squad car down the street, it couldn't undo it. The terror I felt knowing he had already been inside my life, already mapped out my habits, already proven that he could reach me psychologically in ways the police could not defend against. And the longer I thought about that, the more I felt myself being consumed by a fear that was all-encompassing, that made every normal sound dim. My apartment feel like a prelude to something worse. Every passerby on the street feel like a threat. Every minor creak of a floorboard or rustle of paper feel like confirmation that he was near. And I began to realize that my own mind had become a prison, a place where he could reign unchecked, and that was worse than any physical attack, because the cage of fear and vigilance was inescapable, and I could feel it pressing on me day and night, wearing me down, making me question every choice, every routine, every decision. And I became hyper-aware of even the smallest details, how long I left the lights on, how far I walked before entering my apartment, what kind of groceries I bought when I checked my phone, even the position I slept in, because all of these details could be monitored, could be exploited, and I couldn't stop thinking about them, couldn't stop imagining the precision it took to know these things, to choose to communicate with him in this exact way, is to remind me that no matter what I did, no matter where I went, he was there, always watching, always studying, always controlling the narrative, and that realization made my world shrink into the apartment, into the office, into the paths I traveled, and eventually into the constant presence of the letters themselves, stacked, folded, threatening, waiting, like living reminders that I was caught in a game I had not agreed to. A game in which the rules were written by a maniac, and the stakes were nothing less than my own life, both physical and mental. And in the days that followed, I found myself unable to concentrate at work, able to speak without my voice trembling, unable to look at anyone in the eye without imagining them as him, because the paranoia had seeped into everything. And every small interaction became a test, every glance a possible surveillance, every note or message a potential signal that he was always close. And when I lay in bed at night, I would replay my day in agonizing detail, examining every choice, every movement, every action, convinced that he had observed all of it, judging it, planning his next step, and the cycle never ended, never slowed, never offered a reprieve. And even as the police intensified their investigation, even as Alvarez promised protection and monitoring, I knew the letters themselves had already. One, because they had proven his reach, his precision, his ability to invade my mind and my life without ever showing his face. And I realized that from this point forward, survival was about vigilance, about calculation, about reading every word, every shadow, every movement with a heightened awareness that I had never known before. And I could feel the weight of that awareness pressing down on me constantly, making every second of every day a struggle against the invisible, the unseen, the predatory force that had claimed my life as his own to observe, to manipulate, and to terrify. And even now, as I look back on those days, I can still feel the tension, the fear, the constant pulse of dread that was my reality. Because when someone like that chooses you, chooses to make you part of their story, there is no return to normalcy, no return to safety, no return to the life you once knew, only the relentless, inescapable presence of a mind that watches, calculates, and waits. and the knowledge that the next move is always theirs, and I had to learn to live every day under that shadow, to survive under that pressure, to exist in a reality where someone could reach into my life and touch me with words, with photographs, with warnings, and I was powerless to stop it, except to endure, to persist, and to hope that somehow, against all odds, I could outlast him, outthink him, and survive the game he had forced me into. By the time the 10th day passed since the last letter in the photographs, I felt as though my life had been completely consumed by the presence of this man, by the knowledge that someone had mapped my world so thoroughly that even the smallest actions could be interpreted, recorded, and twisted into some form of control over me. And it wasn't just the physical fear anymore, it was the mental exhaustion, the constant tension that gripped me from the moment I opened my eyes to the moment I forced myself to sleep. The cycle so relentless, I began noticing how the shadows in my apartment seemed to move differently, how the hum of the refrigerator felt like a whisper, how every distant sound in the building could be imagined as him. Footsteps pacing outside my door, a pen scratching across paper somewhere near, a faint breath in the corner of a room where no one should be, and the worst part was knowing that my imagination, my fears, my very mind had become his playground. Thus, he had demonstrated through the letters, the photographs, the intimate knowledge of my habits, and that he could manipulate me without ever being physically present. And that realization weighed on me like a lead blanket, pressing down so heavily that even breathing felt like a struggle. Yet, at the same time, I couldn't stop analyzing, couldn't stop looking for patterns, for clues, for any hint that might reveal the next step in his game or a way to regain some semblance of control over my life. Because control was everything. Now, and the absence of it had left me fragile, desperate, and always on edge. I had begun to notice things I never had before. How long certain people lingered near my building, how cars would pass and pause in ways that made me turn my head, how small details of my daily routines, the timing of my coffee, the path I took to the office, the way I held my bag could potentially be left, observed, and exploited. And with each observation, the fear grew, because it meant the world was no longer ordinary, no longer neutral, but a landscape that could be manipulated by someone whose obsession with me was intense, methodical, and terrifying. And as I walked to work one morning, I found myself scanning the windows of buildings, checking reflections in car mirrors, glancing behind trees and parked cars, imagining him anywhere, and every step felt like moving through a minefield, because the thought that he could be waiting anywhere, hidden, patient, meant that I could never truly relax, could never allow myself to act without calculation. And even the most mundane actions became exercises in survival, because I had been forced to see my life through the eyes of someone who had already taken lives, and now chose to focus on me. The letters had escalated in tone by this point. They were no longer simple confessions or warnings. They had become lessons, almost instruction, teaching me through fear, showing me that he wanted me to understand, to feel, to live with the knowledge of how completely he could infiltrate my world. And when I read phrases like, I know where you go, I know what you do, I know the thoughts you think when you think you are alone, I felt my chest tighten, because it wasn't just threat anymore, it was evidence that he could reach me anywhere, anytime, and the idea that no space was safe, no moment private, no action unobserved, crushed me with a weight I couldn't escape from. And even as I tried to rationalize, to tell myself that the police were working, that Detective Alvarez was monitoring, that they would find something, I knew that those assurances did little to soothe the psychological torment, because he didn't need to be caught to haunt me, to control me, to dominate my thoughts, and that knowledge made every day feel like a battle in which I was already losing. One afternoon, I found myself walking past a coffee shop I had frequented, and I froze when I saw a man sitting inside, reading a newspaper, glancing occasionally toward the street. And for a terrifying moment, I imagined that he was him, that, with years of observation, planning, and communication, had brought him here. And I had no way to know if that was real or paranoia, because by this point, my mind was a battlefield, a place where fear and imagination collided in every small signal, every subtle movement. Every glance could be interpreted as threat, and that made living almost impossible, as I couldn't trust the world, couldn't trust strangers, couldn't trust even my own instincts, as they were constantly manipulated by the presence of someone who had studied me, who had already proven he could reach me psychologically, and the idea that he could anticipate my reaction, that he could push me in directions I hadn't even considered, made me feel trapped in a story I didn't want to be part of, but couldn't escape. That evening, when I returned home, the apartment felt smaller, darker, more suffocating, as though it had shrunk around me to emphasize the isolation, the danger, the constant scrutiny. And on the kitchen counter lay another envelope, heavier, then the others, sealed in black wax, with my name written in the same careful, jagged hand that had become a symbol of dread in my life. And when I picked it up, I could feel the weight of it, both physically and psychologically, because it was a reminder that no matter how careful I was, no matter how much I tried to analyze, plan, or anticipate, he could still reach me, still communicate with me, still infiltrate my life. And inside, I found more photographs, some of me entering my apartment, some of me leaving, and each one had tiny notes scrawled in the margins: the left hand, the right hand, the tilt of your head, the curve of your shoulder. You understand how closely I observed. And for a long moment, I just stared at them, unable to comprehend that someone had been this close, had seen me in ways no one should. I recorded these details for some purpose I couldn't yet imagine. And then there was a letter folded into the photographs, and as I unfolded it, my stomach churned, because it began with the words, "You are learning. You understand now that you belong to this story, and there is no escaping. T, but you are clever. You might survive if you follow carefully what I show you, if you pay attention, if you live as I instruct." I read the words over and over, my hands shaking, my mind spinning with a mixture of terror, confusion, and a perverse sense of obligation, because the message was clear. My survival depended on complying, on thinking in ways dictated by him, on letting fear guide me as though it were a map, and the realization that he had engineered my existence to this point, that every letter, every photograph, every carefully chosen word was part of a plan to mold my thoughts, to dominate my perception, was overwhelming, and I felt myself sink to the floor, the envelope still clutched in my hands. And as I sat there, trembling, I realized that the person writing to me was not just a killer, not just an observer, not just a predator. He was a manipulator of the mind, a sculptor of terror, someone who could bend reality for me without ever being present. And that knowledge made me feel small, powerless, and completely exposed. And yet, it also ignited a spark. Because if he had to communicate, if he had to leave letters, if he had to insert himself in my life in this way, there had to be a flaw. A point where I could fight back, where I could find leverage. And even though the fear was suffocating, even though sleep was a distant memory, even though the walls of my apartment seemed to close in on me, I began to think, to plot, to analyze, because surviving meant more than hiding. It meant understanding, and if I could find the pattern, if I could understand the way he operated, then maybe, just maybe, I could take back a small part of my life, reclaim a fragment of control, and hold on to the fragile hope that this nightmare, which had become my reality, might one day end, or at least that I might endure it without losing everything I had left of myself. By the time chapter 11 began in my mind, though I hadn't yet written it down, my life had become a series of rigid routines, designed entirely around avoiding surprises, avoiding danger, and trying desperately to anticipate what he would do next, because every step outside our apartment, every phone call, every movement through the city felt like a potential opportunity for him to observe, to learn, to manipulate, and yet, even with all my precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already behind, that he had a plan, a map of my life, a timeline that I wasn't even aware of, and the knowledge that someone could plan so meticulously, watch so carefully, and control my thoughts without ever being physically present, left me both terrified and strangely obsessed. Because if I didn't analyze everything, if I didn't scrutinize every letter, every photograph, every minor detail in my daily routine, I felt like I would lose even more control over the small fragments of memory I still had in that day. As I sat at my desk at work, pretending to focus on my tasks while my mind raced, I realized that the letters had become more than just threats. They had become a conversation, a way for him to insert himself into my life in a way that made me feel both pursued and compelled to engage, compelled to respond, even if only internally, and the psychological weight of that engagement was almost unbearable, because it meant that he didn't need to be in the room. He didn't need to touch me. He didn't need to be physically present, to dominate, to manipulate, to terrorize. All he needed was a knowledge of my habits, the power of his words, and the photographs that documented my every move. And I found myself going through the streets with my eyes scanning every reflection, every window, every parked car, imagining his gaze on me, imagining that any passerby could be him, imagining that the shadow behind me could be watching, following, documenting, and that paranoia became a lens through which I experienced the world, and every interaction, no matter how small, became loaded with suspicion, because I could no longer distinguish between normal human behavior and potential threat, and I began to notice subtle details I had never cared about before. The way a stranger's eyes lingered a fraction of a second too long, the way a car slowed behind me for no apparent reason, the patterns in the city that seemed meaningless until I imagined them as signals, as instructions, as steps in some plan designed to draw me further into a mental trap. And as the days passed, I became hyper-aware of my apartment as well, constantly checking locks, doors, windows, closets, even small cracks in walls, even thinking about how easily someone could enter unnoticed if they were careful. They had been watching as closely as the letters and photographs suggested. And the thought of that made my stomach twist every time I considered leaving my home, because no matter how careful I was outside, my sanctuary felt violated, compromised, and I realized that my entire existence had been reduced to survival in a world where the ordinary could hide danger, where routine could be a weapon, and where fear had become an unrelenting companion that accompanied me everywhere, because the letters had proven that someone could reach inside my life in a way that nothing else could counteract. Not the police, not my own planning, not even my instincts, because he had already anticipated my moves, had already mapped my thoughts, and was teaching me through terror how to live under his scrutiny, how to endure without surrendering, how to survive without being caught. And even as I forced myself to continue my life, continue my job, continue daily interactions with coworkers and strangers, I felt myself fraying, my attention splitting between the task at hand and the constant mental checklist of what to watch for, how to behave, when to pause, and to look over my shoulder, when to anticipate, because every moment could be an opportunity for him to reach me. And that realization made ordinary decisions, like taking the subway, going to a store, even answering a phone call, paralyzed, because any of these moments could be observed, recorded, manipulated, turned into a tool of control. And yet I couldn't stop living, couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop existing in the shadow of this man who had made me the subject of his obsession, the object of his attention, in the audience for his confessions and warnings, and so I forced myself to take steps, to leave the apartment, to go to work, to interact. Even as the letters and photographs lay in a growing pile on my kitchen counter, waiting like a predator poised to strike, reminding me with every glance, every fold, every scrawl that he was always close, always watching, always anticipating, and I realized that this was a game, a psychological chess match in which I was forced to play against someone who had not only planned for my every move, but had also studied my mind, my fears, my reactions, counting who could manipulate my very thoughts through the power of words and images. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized that the physical threat was only part of the danger. There's the mental domination he had established was more complete, more invasive, and inescapable. Thus, no door, no lock, no law enforcement presence could stop the impact of the knowledge that he had already penetrated my life, already controlled my thoughts, already proving that he could reach me anywhere, anytime. And that understanding made me both terrified and desperate to find some countermeasure, some clue, some leverage, some insight that could allow me to reclaim even a fraction of autonomy over my existence. Because without it, I was simply living inside the world he had constructed for me, a world designed to keep me awake, fearful, obedient, and reactive. And as I sat late that night in my apartment, surrounded by notes, photographs, copies of letters, scribbled observations, timelines, and theories, I realized that survival wasn't just about avoiding him physically. It wasn't just about hiding or moving carefully. It was about understanding him, understanding the mechanics of his obsession, understanding the psychology that had enabled him to invade my life so thoroughly. And that task was overwhelming because it required me to enter his mind, to imagine his motives, to anticipate his moves, to learn to live under constant observation without letting despair consume me. And as I stared at the pile of letters and photographs, tracing the lines of his handwriting, studying the angles of the pictures, analyzing the timing of when they arrived, I felt a strange mixture of terror and focus, because the only way forward was to think, to strategize, to prepare, to anticipate. And the only way to survive was to accept that my life had been claimed as part of the story, so that I was now a character in a narrative written with obsession, violence, and manipulation. And that survival meant enduring, analyzing, predicting, and never letting my guard down, because any lapse could be fatal. And as I drifted into the restless sleep that had become my only brief respite, I understood that my world had contracted into this constant vigilance, this perpetual anticipation, this unending mental chess match with a man who had already proven he could reach me. And I realized that every day, every action, every thought, every letter, every photograph, every line of handwriting, every shadow and sound and movement would shape my survival, my endurance, my sanity. And that realization both terrified me and steeled me, because the only way to survive someone like him was to become vigilant beyond reason, clever beyond comprehension, and aware beyond imagination. And even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, even as panic and fear consumed my nights, I knew I had no choice but to live inside the rules he had set, to anticipate the next move, to analyze every detail, to remain hyper-aware, and to fight with every ounce of focus and willpower I had, because if I failed even once, the consequences could be deadly, and that knowledge weighed on me like a storm cloud, constant, dark, unrelenting. And yet it also became a strange kind of clarity, because it forced me to see my world in a way I never had before, to understand the depth of manipulation, the precision of obsession, the terror of being chosen, and the reality of surviving someone who had decided that I was part of the story. And that clarity, terrifying as it was, became my only compass in a world that had been rewritten by fear. The tension that had been slowly building over the past weeks had solidified into a constant, almost tangible presence that I could feel pressing down on me at all times. A suffocating weight that made even the simplest actions feel like monumental tasks, because now I had reached a point where I couldn't go anywhere, couldn't do anything without immediately calculating every potential risk, every possible observation, every hypothetical scenario in which he could be watching, recording, learning, and using that information to control me further. And the mental exhaustion of this constant vigilance was beginning to make itself known in ways that I could no longer ignore. As I found myself snapping at coworkers over minor issues, staring blankly at my computer screen for hours while my mind ran through sequences of escape routes, hiding places, and patterns of his behavior, imagining how he might be monitoring me even now. And every notification on my phone, every envelope that appeared in the mail, every shadow that flickered across my apartment, walls became evidence of his presence, a reminder that he was always close, always patient, always watching, and the psychological manipulation had reached a point where I could feel it in my bones, where the fear had been internalized so completely that my body and mind were both in a state of perpetual alert, a constant readiness to react, flee, or hide. And yet, no matter how vigilant I was, I knew that vigilance alone would not be enough, because he had proven time and again that he could infiltrate my life, reach me psychologically, and assert dominance over my world without ever being physically present. And that realization made every ordinary moment terrifying, every interaction suspect, every decision a potential misstep that could escalate the danger. And I began to notice small details that I had never cared about before. The way someone's shoes tapped on the pavement outside my building, the angle of sunlight through the blinds, the hum of the refrigerator in the background, the distant chatter of people in the street, and all of these ordinary things took on sinister significance, because I had learned that he could use anything to manipulate, to terrify, to assert control. And my mind had been trained to see these ordinary details through the lens of threat and anticipation, creating a world in which nothing was safe. Nothing was normal, and every moment was potentially life-threatening. And this constant state of hyper-awareness began to isolate me further, because I could no longer engage normally with friends, co-workers, even strangers, without imagining that he was nearby, serving, judging, manipulating, and the loneliness that resulted was crushing, because fear had taken over, replacing normal human connection with vigilance, with suspicion, with the endless calculation of survival strategies. And yet, even in this extreme mental state, there was a part of me that was compelled to study him, and to analyze his letters, his photographs, his timing, his tone, trying desperately to understand the mind behind the obsession, because I had come to realize that understanding was my only weapon, my only hope, and without it, I would be lost, a prey that could not anticipate its predator. And so I spent hours each day reviewing the letters, preparing photographs, noting patterns, trying to predict the next move, even as my body and mind screamed for rest, for distraction, for return to some semblance of normal life. But normal life no longer existed. And the thought that it might never return was a shadow that hovered over every thought, every plan, every cautious step I took. And then came the phone call, a single, chilling ring that made my blood run cold, because I knew before I even answered that it was him. And when I picked up, the voice on the other end was calm, deliberate, and entirely too familiar, saying nothing at first, just breathing in a way that made my skin crawl. And then slowly, words emerged, low, measured, and unnervingly intimate, describing in detail something I had done that day, some minor choice, some small action that had seemed insignificant until it was recounted to me in the precise and obsessive way only he could. And the realization that he had been observing me in real time, that he could see me, hear me, follow me, manipulate me without ever revealing himself physically brought a level of terror that I hadn't thought possible, because this was no longer just about letters or photographs or messages sent. It was direct interaction. It was proof that he could reach into my life at any moment, and the power imbalance was suffocating, crushing, leaving me shaking, trembling, unable to speak without stammering. And even as I held the phone, trying to remember every detail of the conversation, every inflection, every pause, every subtle hint hidden within ordinary words, I knew that this moment was another step in a carefully orchestrated campaign, a psychological assault designed to remind me of his control, to enforce the fear he had been cultivating over weeks. And the depth of his manipulation was staggering, because it required patience, observation, knowledge, and an intimate understanding of how to push a person to the edge without ever revealing himself fully. And as I ended the call, my hands trembling, my mind racing, my heart pounding, I realized that the letters, the photographs, the calls, they were all connected, a network of terror, a carefully constructed web in which I was ensnared. And the question that haunted me more than anything was not whether he would strike physically, but whether I could survive the mental assault he had perfected, whether I could endure the fear, the anxiety, the constant vigilance without losing myself completely, because the letters had already proven that he could reach me anywhere, anytime, and I had no control over that reach, no control over the knowledge that he had mapped my life, understood my habits, learned my weaknesses, could exploit them at will. And as the days stretched into weeks, I found myself living in a state of extreme mental awareness, analyzing, calculating, watching, imagining, every sense sharpened, every instinct on high alert, because I had learned that survival depended on vigilance, that any lapse could be fatal, and yet this vigilance was exhausting, wearing down my body, my mind, my ability to maintain normal function. And I began to understand that the challenge was not just to survive them physically, but to survive them psychologically, to maintain my sense of self, my sanity, my ability to reason and act, even as he worked to infiltrate every aspect of my life, to manipulate, to dominate, to terrify. And in that awareness, I realized that the letters, the photographs, the calls, the messages were all designed not just to communicate, but to shape my reality, to force me to see the world through his eyes, to live according to the parameters he set, to be hyper-aware of my vulnerability, my fear, my exposure. And the more I internalized that, the more I understood that I had no choice but to engage, to analyze, to anticipate, to try to predict, to try to reclaim even a fraction of control over the life that he had claimed for himself. And that struggle became my life, my daily reality, my constant focus. And even as exhaustion, panic, and fear threatened to overwhelm me, I forced myself to continue, because surrender was not an option, because the letters had proven mistakes, and because the only path forward was to endure, to survive, and to hope that one day, against all odds, I could find a way to escape the psychological grasp of a man who had proven himself capable of infiltrating the most private corners of my life, observing, recording, manipulating, and controlling me without ever being physically present. And that knowledge, terrifying as it was, became the axis around which my existence rotated, the defining factor in every thought, every action, every cautious step, every glance, every careful movement, because I had come to understand that in this game, vigilance was survival, and survival depended on my ability to anticipate, to analyze, to endure, and to maintain some semblance of control in a world that he had meticulously constructed to dominate and terrify me. And that understanding, as oppressive as it was also the only thing that kept me moving forward, even as I felt my life shrink into the shadow of his obsession, into the tight, relentless coil of fear, into the mental battlefield he had created. and I knew that this battle was far from over, that the letters, the photographs, the calls, and the observations would continue, that he would continue to test me, manipulate me, invade my life, and that my only chance to survive was to remain vigilant beyond reason, aware beyond imagination, and psychologically resilient beyond what I thought possible, because he had already proven that he could reach me anywhere, anytime. And that was the terrifying reality I had to live with every second of every day. The relentless psychological pressure had reached a point where it was almost unbearable, because now I was not only hyper-aware of my surroundings, my routines, and the letters, photographs, and messages, but I was also painfully conscious of Knut, my man, because I was also painfully conscious of how deeply he had already invaded my life, how thoroughly he had mapped every detail, every habitual movement, every predictable response, and the realization that he had been observing me for weeks, possibly months, made me feel as though I had no privacy, no sanctuary, no place where I could exist without being studied, analyzed, and manipulated. And even my apartment, which had once been a safe haven, felt like a cage, a stage set for his control, a place where I was constantly reminded of my vulnerability, and the fact that my life was now a story he was writing in real time, with me as both protagonist and captive audience. And that understanding was crushing, because it meant that even when I thought I was alone, even when I closed the door behind me, even when I tried to rest or relax, I was never truly free, and every sound, every shadow, every minor imperfection. And my environment became a source of anxiety, a potential clue that he had been there, or that he could be observing me now. And this constant tension led into every aspect of my life, from the way I walked down the street to the way I held my phone, to the way I interacted with coworkers, friends, or even strangers passing by on the sidewalk, because every interaction could be a test, every casual glance a signal, every word overheard a potential manipulation. And as the days stretched into weeks, I realized that my world had shrunk into a tight spiral of fear and vigilance, a life governed entirely by the anticipation of his next move, and I began to obsess over patterns, timelines, and the subtle details embedded in his letters and photographs, because they were the only concrete evidence of his presence and intentions. And yet even that study brought no comfort, only a growing awareness of the extent of his control, the precision of his observation, and the patient, calculated nature of his obsession. And on this particular morning, as I prepared to leave my apartment, I noticed something subtle, yet chilling. A small envelope had been slipped under my door, unmarked except for my name, in the same jagged, deliberate handwriting that had haunted me for weeks. And as I picked it up, I could feel the weight of it, not just physically, but psychologically, because it represented yet another intrusion, yet another reminder that I was being watched. And when I carefully opened it, I found a single photograph, sharp, clear, taken from a distance, of me walking down the street just an hour before, completely unaware, completely exposed. And the hair on my arms stood on end as I noticed the details he had captured, the tilt of my head, the way my back swung as I walked, the curve of my shoulder. Every tiny, intimate aspect of my posture had been observed and documented, and below the photograph, on a small slip of paper, were the words, "You can run, you can hide, you can try to escape, but you are already in my world." And I felt my stomach drop, my heart hammering in my chest, because it was not just a threat, it was a statement, a declaration of ownership, a proof that he had mapped my life with such detail that no corner of it remained private, and the knowledge that he could be anywhere, that he had already observed me so closely, that he could continue to infiltrate my existence at will, made me feel both panicked and helpless, because no physical barriers, no police presence, no personal vigilance could undo what had already been done, could reclaim the privacy that had been stolen, could erase the evidence of his intimate knowledge of my life. And as I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the photograph and rereading the note over and over, I realized that my survival now depended not only on vigilance, but on understanding him, predicting him, staying one step ahead. And yet every day that passed only reinforced how far ahead he already was, how meticulously he had studied me, and how carefully he orchestrated the psychological pressure that was slowly consuming me. Because every letter, every photograph, every subtle communication was designed to heighten my fear, to erode my confidence, to remind me that I was never alone, never safe, never free, and the realization that I had been drawn into a game over, which I had no control, made each breath feel heavier, each step feel more calculated, each interaction feel like a minefield. And I began to notice the smallest details in my environment, from the angle of the blinds to the shadows cast by passing cars, to the faint echo of footsteps in the hallway. And even the most mundane events became potential signs of his presence, because the fear had trained me to see the world through a lens of constant observation, constant calculation, constant anticipation. And this mental state was exhausting, eroding my ability to maintain normal function, my focus at work, my relationships, okay, and even my basic sense of well-being, because every thought was consumed with survival, every action measured, every movement considered in terms of how he might perceive it, how it might be recorded, how it might be used to manipulate me further, okay. And as the days went on, I found myself analyzing everything with obsessive intensity, creating timelines, noting the arrival of letters, cross-referencing photographs, recording subtle clues, okay, and attempting to discern patterns, because the only way I could feel even a semblance of control was to study him as much as he studied me, to anticipate, to prepare, to strategize. And even then, there was no certainty, because his patience, his precision, his meticulous planning meant that he could always adapt, he could always anticipate my responses, could always maintain the psychological upper hand. And this awareness only heightened my fear, my tension, my sense of entrapment, because it meant that no matter what I did, was never truly ahead, never truly safe, never truly free. And that knowledge pressed on me constantly, a relentless reminder of his dominance, his obsession, and my vulnerability. And as I tried to eat, to sleep, to perform even basic tasks, I could feel the weight of it, the constant calculation, the endless vigilance, the suffocating presence of someone who had claimed a part of my mind, as my life and my sanity as his own. And even in moments of grief, distraction, or fleeting hope, I was pulled back into the reality that I had been chosen, served, and meticulously studied, and that survival depended entirely on my ability to maintain mental control, anticipate his actions, and endure the relentless psychological assault. Because he had already proven that he could reach me anywhere, anytime, and that there was no escape from the web of fear, observation, and manipulation that he had woven around my life. And as I sat there, staring at the photograph, rereading the note, my mind racing with every possible scenario, every potential strategy, every calculated move, I realized that the only path forward was to remain vigilant, beyond reason, aware, beyond imagination, and resilient beyond comprehension. Because the man who had chosen me was patient, calculated, relentless, and already had control over a life that I could no longer consider my own. And that realization both terrified me and forced me to focus, because without focus, without preparation, without understanding, I knew that I would not survive the next phase of his plan, whatever that might be. And so I resolved, with a mixture of fear and determination, to continue studying, analyzing, preparing, and surviving in a world that had been irrevocably claimed by someone who had already proven he could reach me anywhere, anytime, and manipulate my life and my mind with precision and cruelty that I could never have imagined until I became the target of his obsession. I had begun to feel as if my existence had been compressed into a series of hyperware moments, each one demanding vigilance beyond normal human capacity. Thus by now, I understood that his obsession was not just about observing, recording, or sending letters and photographs. Sid was about total psychological domination, a methodical infiltration into my life that left no corner untouched, no moment unexamined, and no thought private. And every day became an exhausting exercise in survival, in anticipation, and calculating the smallest details of my movements, to avoid being seen or manipulated in ways that could escalate the danger. And yet, even with the obsessive precautions I had forced myself to adopt, the realization remained that he was always ahead, always patient, always studying, always planning, because the letters and photographs had made it clear that he was not a reckless predator, but a meticulous strategist. Someone who could watch for weeks, observe patterns, note habits, and then exploit them in ways that were invisible until it was too late. And the terror of that knowledge settled into my bones, into my muscles, into every part of my body, creating a tension that made even breathing feel deliberate, heavy, significant. Because every action could be a potential trigger, every movement, a potential observation, every misstep, an opportunity for him to tighten his grip on my life. And as the days blurred together, I realized that I had lost the ability to see the world as it truly was. That everything had been filtered through a lens of surveillance, manipulation, and fear, so that even a sunny afternoon felt loaded with danger. Every passerby a potential observer, every car a potential threat, every reflection in a shop window or puddle a possible hint of his presence. And when the psychological strain of this constant vigilance was beginning to manifest physically, and the way my muscles ached, my stomach twisted, my head throbbed with tension, and yet I could not afford to stop, could not afford to relax, because he had proven with every letter, every photograph, every call, that my safety depended entirely on it, my alertness, my anticipation, and my ability to think in ways he could not fully predict. And that understanding both terrified and focused me, because it was the only way I could attempt to survive the meticulous mental assault he had orchestrated. And that day, as I stepped out of my apartment to grab a few necessary supplies, I noticed something strange in the pattern of my surroundings, a subtle shift that immediately set my instincts on edge, because the car that usually passed my building at a certain time had not moved, had lingered just long enough for me to feel that it was not coincidental, that someone inside could be waiting, observing, documenting, and my pulse quickened as I realized this was no longer just imagination or paranoia, but a tangible manifestation of the calculated threat that had become my life, and every decision from whether to cross the street, which path to take to the store, to whether to enter or wait outside, became a critical calculation, because he had made it clear that he could reach me anyway, and every observation I made could be anticipated, manipulated, or exploited. And as I walked cautiously, scanning reflections, noting shadows, monitoring the distance and movement of every person, every vehicle, I felt the full weight of the psychological game he had constructed, a game in which I was both player and prey, constantly reacting, constantly analyzing, constantly wondering if this step, this glance, this breath would be the one that allowed him to take another inch of control, another degree of power over my life. And as I reached the store, found myself performing rituals I had unconsciously developed over the past weeks, checking for cameras, scanning the eyes for suspicious behavior, noting who was where, and even as I did this, I felt the familiar surge of panic when I realized that none of this would fully protect me, that he could observe from a distance, from a reflection, or a momentary lapse in my awareness, and that the letters had already demonstrated that he had the patience to wait, to watch, to learn, to manipulate, and I understood that every ordinary, Action was now an opportunity for him to assert his psychological dominance, a realization that left me both terrified and intensely focused, because while the fear was suffocating, the knowledge that understanding his patterns, predicting his moves, and maintaining hypervigilance might be my only path to survival became the only thing that anchored me in the face of such relentless terror. And as I moved through the store, my eyes constantly scanned, my ears attuned to every sound, my mind calculating every possible observation and reaction. I noticed a small envelope slipped under the edge of the shelf near the checkout line, perfectly placed, as though left deliberately for me to find, and my hands trembled as I picked it up, feeling the weight of it both physically and psychologically, because it was yet another proof that he had engineered this moment, that he could insert himself into my environment at will. And inside, I found another photograph, this one taken from a distance outside my building, showing me leaving for the store. And the note beneath it read, "Even here, you cannot hide. Even here, I am with you. Even here, your movements are mine to watch." My pulse spiked, my stomach churned, my body flooded with adrenaline, and I felt both terror and a strange, focused clarity, because the message was not only a warning, but an undeniable proof of his reach, his patience, his calculated manipulation. And I understood with chilling precision that he had transformed my world into a landscape of fear, where survival depended entirely on my ability to anticipate, to calculate, to remain hyper-aware, and to endure the relentless psychological assault. And that night, as I returned to my apartment, my mind spinning with the weight of what I had seen, I realized that sleep did not bring relief, that the letters and photographs, the surveillance, the manipulation, had claimed even the sanctuary of my own mind, because every thought would now be filtered through the lens of his obsession. Every memory, every movement, every fear magnified, and as I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the glowing pile of letters and photographs, I felt the overwhelming weight of the psychological war that had become my life, because the man who had chosen me had already proven his ability to reach inside my world, to dominate, manipulate, terrify, and observe. And I understood that my survival would depend not only on vigilance, but on mental resilience, anticipation, and the ability to endure the unending, pervasive, all-encompassing control he exerted through fear, observation, and relentless patience. And even as exhaustion, panic, and dread threatened to overwhelm me, I realized that there was no choice but to continue, because surrender meant losing everything. And the only way to maintain even a fragment of my life, my mind, my sanity, was to remain hyper-aware, to anticipate, to strategize, to endure, to survive, and to hope that somewhere within this meticulously constructed nightmare, I could find a moment, a loophole, a flaw, a chance to reclaim even a tiny fraction of control. Because without that hope, I understood I would be consumed entirely by the relentless, suffocating, inescapable grip of a man who had already proven he could reach me anywhere, anytime, and manipulate my life with an intensity and precision that defied comprehension. The suffocating weight of constant surveillance and psychological manipulation had become an inseparable part of my existence, so that every waking moment, every simple task, every minor decision was overshadowed by the awareness that he was always watching, always calculating, always waiting, in the realization that my life had been transformed into an unending maze of observation and terror left me exhausted, both mentally and physically, because I could no longer allow myself the luxury of relaxation or distraction without immediately analyzing the potential consequences. Every shadow, every passerby, every sound a possible sign of his presence. And as I moved through my apartment, I noticed that the letters and photographs had begun to pile higher, not just in physical space, but in psychological weight. Each one a reminder of how thoroughly he had infiltrated my life, how meticulously he had tracked my habits, and how patient he had been in constructing a network of fear so precise that I could no longer remember what normal life had felt like. And that day, as I tried to focus on work, my hands shaking slightly as I typed on my keyboard, I realized that the control he exerted extended far beyond what I had anticipated, because it was not simply a matter of fear or threat, but of an invasive, intimate understanding of my every habit, preference, and weakness, a knowledge so detailed that even the smallest routine movements were accounted for, and the letters, photographs, and phone calls were not random. They were lessons, tests, and manipulations designed to condition me to live according to his terms. And as I stared at the growing stack of correspondence on my desk, I noticed that the most recent letter had been delivered in a slightly different manner, tucked carefully inside a folder I used at work. And the handwriting, jagged and familiar, made my stomach drop, because this was not only an intrusion into my personal life, but now into my professional space, proving that his reach extended even here. And as I unfolded the letter, I found detailed descriptions of my movements throughout the day, commentary on the conversations I had had, the expressions on my coworkers' faces, even notes on the items I had purchased during a short lunch break, and beneath it, a message that chilled me to the bone. You cannot separate work from life. You cannot hide from me. Every part of your world belongs to me to observe. The meticulous attention to detail, the calculated observation, the patient and deliberate recording of my daily life. It's a form of psychological domination I have never experienced before, and I felt an overwhelming mix of terror and strange, obsessive fascination. Because the more I tried to understand the methods behind his actions, the more I realized how carefully and patiently he had studied me, how thoroughly he had mapped my life, and how deliberate every intrusion had been, and the knowledge that my professional life had become another arena in which I was being monitored left me feeling exposed and vulnerable in ways that went beyond the personal. It had infected every part of my life, creating a sense that I could never escape, never breathe, never exist without his awareness. And as I attempted to focus on tasks, my mind instead drifted to potential scenarios, escape routes, strategies, and contingencies, because survival now required not just physical caution, but the mental acuity to anticipate, predict, and counteract someone who had proven themselves a step ahead at all times. And even the most mundane interactions, answering emails, talking to colleagues, attending meetings, were shattered by the thought that he could be observing remotely, analyzing, documenting, and using every fragment of information to tighten the control he had over me. And as the afternoon progressed, I noticed a subtle shift in my own behavior. I had begun to unconsciously double-check locks, scan the room before sitting, position myself near exits, and perform countless small rituals that I had not consciously realized I was doing, but which now formed a part of my survival strategy, was even minor lapses to provide him opportunities to assert psychological dominance. And in that awareness, I began to feel the full weight of what had been done to me, the transformation of my life into a theater of constant vigilance, the impossibility of returning to normal, and yet a stubborn part of me refused to surrender, entirely clinging to the belief that understanding him, predicting him, and remaining mentally vigilant would give me a chance, even if it was a slim one, to reclaim fragments of my autonomy, to survive in a world that had been rewritten by fear, observation, and manipulation. And that evening, as I returned home, I found a new letter slipped under my apartment door, smaller and lighter than previous ones, but carrying a weight that made my hands tremble as I held it. And inside was a single photograph, taken from a distance of my apartment window, showing me entering the building with precise timing, and beneath it, a note that read, "I am always here. I am always watching. Your life is mine to follow." The simplicity of the message, combined with the precision of the photograph, sent a wave of terror through me because it was an undeniable proof of his ability to observe me in real time, to track my every movement, and to assert psychological control over every part of my life. And as I sat in my apartment, staring at the photograph, I felt both fear and despair, impulsive need to analyze, to dissect, to understand, because the only way to survive is to comprehend the full scope of his methods, to predict, to anticipate, to calculate, and yet the mental strain was immense, because each analysis led to further fear, further awareness of vulnerability, and the realization that my life had been transformed into a constant exercise in survival, observation, and mental endurance. And as the night deepened, I found myself pacing, scanning my surroundings, checking locks, peering through blinds, listening for unusual sounds. Every nerve on high alert, because the psychological game had expanded beyond letters and photographs into every part of my environment, into every interaction, into every thought, and even as exhaustion threatened to overtake me, I could not rest, could not relax, could not allow myself a moment of distraction, because I understood that vigilance was survival, but that surrender, even momentary, could be catastrophic. And as I reviewed the letters, photographs, and notes, comparing dates, times, details, and patterns, I realized with a mix of horror and grim determination that my entire life had become a study in his obsession, a map of his patience, a record of his meticulous planning, and the only way forward was to continue to endure, to anticipate, to analyze, and to survive. Because the man who had chosen me had already proven he could reach anywhere, anytime, and manipulate both my life and mind with a precision and consistency that defied comprehension, and that knowledge, terrifying as it was, became the axis around which my thoughts, actions, and decisions revolved, compelling me to adapt, endure, and survive in a world that he had transformed into a labyrinth of fear, observation, and relentless psychological domination. And even as I felt the exhaustion, the panic, and the suffocating weight of this unending reality, I understood that surrender was not an option, because he had already claimed my world, my mind, and my sense of security, and the only chance I had to return even a fraction of control, even a sliver of safety, was to remain vigilant, mentally resilient, and unrelentingly aware of the relentless presence and patience of a man who had already proven he could observe, manipulate, and dominate my life in ways I had never imagined possible. I had reached a point where the line between reality and fear had blurred so completely that I could no longer remember a time when I felt truly safe, when the world had felt normal, because now every thought, every step, every interaction was filtered through the lens of his observation and manipulation, and the psychological pressure he had exerted over weeks had reshaped my mind, turning me into someone whose existence was governed entirely by anticipation, calculation, and vigilance, so that even a simple walk down the street became a test, a potential trap, a moment in which his influence could reach me, and the realization that my life had become a theater where his obsession was both terrifying and impossible to escape, because every letter, every photograph, every phone call had proven that he could reach me anywhere, anytime, and manipulate both my environment and my mind with patience and precision. And that day, as I stepped out into the cold morning air, I felt a familiar surge of adrenaline mixed with dread, plus the knowledge that he might already be observing, waiting for some sign, some lapse, some opportunity was overwhelming, and I moved with careful calculation, scanning reflections in windows, noting the distance and movement of passing cars, the angles of shadows, the positions of people on the street, as if every detail might contain a clue or a threat. And the mental strain of this vigilance was exhausting, because it demanded an intensity of focus that left no room for relaxation, no margin for error, No escape from the suffocating awareness that my life was now a constant game of observation and survival. And as I walked past a row of parked cars, I noticed something subtle but chilling. A vehicle that I didn't recognize was positioned in a way that suggested it had been waiting. And the sight made my heart race and my pulse stop because I immediately imagined him inside, watching, recording, calculating. And the fear that followed was both sharp and suffocating, because it reminded me that his reach was not just in letters or photographs, but in real time, in the physical world, in the spaces. I thought I could navigate safely, and as I continued on, my mind raced through contingency plans, escape routes, potential hiding places, scenarios of confrontation, and ways to regain control. Because survival now required an intense mental map of my environment, a constant calculation of risk, and a deep understanding of how he might observe and exploit my actions. And yet, even as I strategized, I could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing on me, my body tense, my muscles aching from the constant readiness, my mind straining under the endless vigilance. And I realized that the psychological manipulation had become as dangerous as any physical threat, as it had eroded my ability to relax, to think clearly, to act naturally, leaving me in a state of near constant panic and hyper-awareness. When I reached my destination, a small cafe where I had hoped to get a moment of distraction, I found a subtle envelope tucked under the door, so small and discreet that it could have been mistaken for a piece of litter. And yet, as I picked it up, my hands trembled, because I knew immediately who it was from. And inside, I found another photograph, this one capturing me through the cafe window, sitting alone at a table, and beneath it, a note that read, "Even in your moments of rest, you are mine to observe. You cannot escape my sight, my knowledge, my control." And the simplicity and precision of the message made my stomach churn. Of course, it was undeniable proof of his ability to insert himself into my life at will, to assert dominance and control over even the smallest moments, and the mental weight of that knowledge pressed down on me like a physical force, making it almost impossible to focus, to breathe, to think beyond the immediate terror. And yet, I knew that surrendering to fear would be fatal, that my survival depended on maintaining mental clarity. Even as my mind screamed in panic, and I forced myself to analyze, to consider patterns, timing, methods, and possible next moves, because the letters and photographs were not merely threats, they were lessons in his obsession, windows into his methodical mind, and studying them became both a necessity and a compulsion, because understanding his behavior was the only tool I had to predict, to anticipate, to maintain some degree of control in a life that he had otherwise claimed. And as the day wore on, I realized that every small act, every routine motion, every casual glance or step could be recorded, analyzed, and used to manipulate me further. And the understanding that I had become a subject in a game far beyond my comprehension both terrified and focused me, because while the psychological pressure was crushing, the knowledge that I could analyze, anticipate, and the depth gave me the only sliver of hope I had for survival. And even as I returned home that evening, my eyes scanning the street, my ears listening for any unusual sound, my mind racing with contingency plans, I found a new envelope slipped under my apartment door. And this one contained not only a photograph, but a series of detailed observations about my previous day, tracking my movements, interactions, and even minor facial expressions. And beneath it, a note that chilled me to my core. I know your routines, I know your thoughts, I know your fears. Your life is an open book, and I am the author. And as I stared at the note, the room spinning with panic and adrenaline, I felt both terror and an almost hypnotic compulsion to study, to analyze, to understand, because in the midst of overwhelming fear, I realized that comprehension, vigilance, and anticipation were the only weapons I had. the only hope of attaining even a fraction of autonomy. And as the night deepened, I found myself pacing, scanning, analyzing, reviewing every letter, every photograph, every observation, every interaction of the past weeks, trying desperately to map his methods, his timing, his obsession to predict the next move, to anticipate the next intrusion, because survival had become an exercise in mental acuity as much as physical caution, and even as my body trembled, my mind raced, and exhaustion threatened to overtake me, I understood that surrender was impossible, that the man who had chosen me had already proven his capacity for patient, meticulous, obsessive control, and that my only chance was to endure, to remain hyper-aware, to study, to anticipate, to calculate, and to survive in a world in which every letter, every photograph, every movement, every thought, and every breath had become part of the carefully orchestrated web of his obsession. Okay, and as I sat amidst the glowing pile of letters, photographs, and notes, I felt the crushing weight of the realization that my life had been transformed into a labyrinth of fear, observation, and psychological domination, and the only path forward, terrifying as it was to continue enduring, continue analyzing, continue surviving, because he had already demonstrated that he could reach me anywhere, anytime, and that knowledge, as terrifying as it was, had become the only thing I could cling to in order to maintain even the faintest hope of surviving the relentless, suffocating, all-encompassing control of a man who had already claimed my life in every sense. That mattered. The suffocating grip of constant vigilance had woven itself so completely into the fabric of my daily existence that I could no longer remember a time when my mind had been free, when my thoughts had not been filtered through a lens of fear and anticipation, because now every action, every glance, every step I took was dominated by the awareness that he was always observing, always calculating, always patient, and the realization that my life had become a continuous landscape of manipulation, and psychological control made the simplest moments unbearable, because I understood that every letter, every photograph, every phone call had been carefully constructed to maintain dominance, to assert presence, to erode my confidence and sense of safety. And as I moved through my apartment that morning, preparing for another day of what I could only describe as survival, I noticed small changes in my surroundings, subtle shifts in objects, slight displacements that immediately set my nerves on edge, because after weeks of observation, I had learned that even the smallest detail could signal his presence. A calculated intrusion meant to remind me that I was never alone, that every corner of my life, no matter how private, was within his reach, and as I attempted to focus on mundane tasks like making coffee, brushing my teeth, or organizing my workspace, I found myself performing mental checks, rehearsing routines, scanning for shadows, noting angles of light, imagining lines of sight from windows and doorways, because survival had become as much a mental exercise as a physical one, and every lapse in attention could be exploited, every miscalculation could be fatal, and I realized with an almost overwhelming clarity that his obsession had reshaped my brain, my perception, and my understanding of reality, so that ordinary life now felt like a maze of traps, a network of surveillance, a game in which I was both the subject and the target. And even as I left my apartment, the air thick with tension, I found myself analyzing every detail of my route, every reflection in the storefront, every pedestrian and passing car, because the knowledge that he could be anywhere at any time, observing and recording, had transformed every space into a potential arena of control. And the intensity of the psychological pressure was exhausting, because it demanded absolute focus, constant calculation, care, and the vigilance that I could feel in every muscle, every nerve, every thought. And as I walked to the corner store for a few necessities, I noticed a vehicle parked slightly out of place, its engine off, windows tinted, positioned in a way that suggested it had been waiting. My chest tightened, my pulse spiking as I imagined him inside, watching, tracking, documenting, and the fear that rose in me was suffocating because it was confirmation that his reach extended beyond letters and photographs into the tangible, physical world, a world I had once assumed was safe, but which he had now claimed as part of the psychological landscape he controlled. And as I entered the store, I became acutely aware of every sound, every reflection, every movement, as if the ordinary space had been transformed into a field of observation, a testing ground for his patience, his meticulous attention, his obsessive control. And while I tried to focus on choosing my items, my mind was relentlessly calculating who might be watching, from where, with what intent, what patterns could I discern, and how could I prepare for the next intrusion. Because each photograph, each note, each observation had been a step in a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to condition me to feel, to anticipate, to live in a state of perpetual tension. And as I approached the checkout, I noticed a small envelope tucked near. The counter, easily missed by anyone else, but impossible for me to ignore. And as I picked it up, my hands trembled. I felt the familiar surge of panic and dread because I knew immediately who it was from. And inside was a photograph taken from the street, showing me standing at the entrance, and beneath it, a note in jagged, deliberate handwriting. You cannot hide, you cannot escape, you cannot find sanctuary. Your movements are my design. Your life belongs to me to watch, and the clarity of the message, combined with the precision of the photograph, brought my stomach to my throat, my pulse to a hammering beat. My mind racing with calculations, strategies, contingency plans, because it was undeniable proof of his patience, his obsessive observation, and his ability to assert psychological control in every corner of my life. Came, and as I left the store, I felt the oppressive weight of his presence, even without physical evidence, a shadow that had settled over me, infiltrating my thoughts, my actions, my very perception of the world, and even in my apartment that night. I could not escape it, because the psychological assault had claimed my mind, making every memory, every reflection, every glance a reminder of my vulnerability and his meticulous power. And as I examined the stack of letters, photographs, and notes, I began to notice patterns I had missed before, subtle details that revealed his timing, his methods, his obsession, and the realization that he had mapped my life so thoroughly that even the smallest movements had been recorded and analyzed, sent a shiver of fear and fascination through me, because understanding his obsession is the only weapon I had. It's the only way to anticipate, to survive, to maintain even a fraction of control. And yet each discovery, each insight brought not comfort, but further anxiety, because it confirmed the depth, patience, and thoroughness of his planning, and the mental strain of trying to keep pace with his calculations, to predict his next move, to maintain vigilance across every area of my life was exhausting, unrelenting, almost overwhelming. And as the night stretched on, I found myself pacing, scanning, replaying scenarios, imagining potential observations, rehearsing routines, and performing countless mental checks, because the psychological pressure demanded absolute attention, and even the smallest lapse could be exploited, could be used to tighten his control, to reinforce the sense of helplessness. And the letters, photographs, and notes were the tools of a strategy that left no room for error, no margin for miscalculation. And as I stared at the photograph taken that afternoon, stood note beneath it, echoing in my mind, I understood with bone-deep certainty that my life had been transformed entirely, that ordinary existence was no longer possible, and that survival depended entirely on mental resilience, hyper-awareness, and the ability to endure a constant, unrelenting assault on my mind, because the man who had chosen me had already demonstrated that he could observe, manipulate, and dominate every aspect of my life, anywhere, anytime, and even as fear and exhaustion threatened to overtake me. I knew that surrender was impossible, because giving in would mean losing everything, and the only way to cling to life, sanity, and any chance of control was to continue analyzing, anticipating, observing, and enduring the relentless, suffocating, all-encompassing psychological domination of someone who had already claimed my world, my mind, and every fragment of my existence as his own, and in that understanding, terrified. As it was, I found a grim determination to survive, to persist, to remain hyper-vigilant, and to endure the nightmare he had meticulously constructed, because the letters, photographs, notes, and observations had proven that he could reach me anywhere, anytime. Okay, and that knowledge had become both my burden and my only weapon in a life that had been irrevocably claimed by fear, observation, and relentless obsession. I had become acutely aware that the psychological stranglehold he maintained over me was growing stronger, more invasive, and more detailed than I had previously imagined. Because it was no longer just the letters, photographs, and subtle intrusions into my apartment or workplace that defined his obsession with had evolved into a constant, living presence in my mind, one that infiltrated every thought, every memory, every decision, so that even when I attempted to rest, sleep, or escape mentally, he was there, lingering in the corners of my awareness. A shadow in every reflection, a presence in every quiet moment. And the sheer intensity of the vigilance I was forced to maintain had transformed my life into an unending exercise in survival, anticipation, and calculation. Because now I knew that my environment, my routines, my interactions, even the smallest gestures and expressions, had become elements of a complex pattern that he was studying, recording, and exploiting for his own obsessive purposes, squaring. And as I moved through my apartment that morning, making coffee, checking the locks on doors and windows, mentally rehearsing every step of the day ahead, I realized that this had become a full-time occupation, one that drained my energy, blurred my perception of normalcy, and left me in a state of perpetual tension, because every object, every sound, every shadow could be evidence of his intrusion. Every envelope, note, and photograph a calculated reminder that he could reach into my world at will, and that thought alone tightened my chest and made my pulse hammer in my veins. And as I stepped outside to begin what should have been a routine walk to the convenience store, I immediately began calculating angles, potential lines of sight, estimating distances, noting the positions of parked cars, pedestrians, and streetlights, because I knew that even a casual, ordinary journey could be observed, documented, and used against me in the ongoing psychological campaign he had constructed. And as I walked, I felt a familiar shiver of dread mixed with a hyper-focused clarity, because while terror threatened to overwhelm me, it also honed my awareness, sharpened my senses, and forced me to exist in a state of heightened perception, where every reflection, every movement, every sound could hold critical information, a clue or a threat, and that balance between fear and focus was exhausting, both mentally and physically, because it demanded an intensity of attention that made ordinary life feel impossible. And every step carried the invisible weight of his calculated observation. Every glance over my shoulder a test, every pause to breathe a potential opportunity for him to assert control. And as I approached the store, my mind racing through contingencies, I noticed a small envelope tucked carefully behind a potted plant outside the entrance, positioned as though it had been placed for my eyes alone. And when I picked it up, my hands trembled uncontrollably because I knew instantly who had left it, and inside I found a photograph, taken from a distance that suggested careful observation over hours or even days, showing me walking from my apartment, and beneath it, a note with jagged, deliberate handwriting that read, "I am always with you I see every step, every turn, every breath. You belong to me in the simplicity of the message. Coupled with the precision of the photograph, sent a wave of panic through my body that made it difficult to think, to breathe, to function. And yet, at the same time, there was an almost compulsive need to analyze, to study, to dissect every detail of the letter and photograph. Because understanding his methods was now the only weapon I had in this relentless psychological battle. And as I walked through the story, my eyes scanning, my senses hyper-alert, my mind racing through possibilities, I noticed subtle details I had not seen before, patterns in the placement of letters, variations in handwriting, angles in photographs, timing of deliveries, and I realized with chilling clarity that he had been learning, adapting, evolving his tactics based on my reactions, my routines, and my increasing awareness, which only reinforced the terrifying truth that he was patient, meticulous, and obsessively controlling, and that the struggle I was enduring was not static, but dynamic, a continuous engagement in which he had already proven superior. Because he had the patience to wait, observe, and calculate at a pace that wore down my mental resilience, and yet the very act of observing, analyzing, and calculating had begun to take a toll on me because the constant mental strain left me fatigued. My thoughts scattered, my body tense, my mind a battlefield of fear, strategy, and obsession, and even, as I left the store, clutching the envelope, scanning for signs of surveillance, replaying scenarios, and mapping potential escape routes, I realized that my life had been irrevocably transformed into a series of high-stakes mental calculations, where every ordinary interaction or decision was a potential test of my survival. And that night, returning home, I found yet another envelope slipped under my apartment door. This one heavier, more substantial, and inside was not just a photograph, but a series of observations, documenting not only my movements, but my facial expressions. The sequence of gestures I had made while walking, my posture, the angle of my head as I looked around, and beneath it, a note that read, "Every moment of your life is mine to see, to record, to know. You cannot hide from me. You are already in my hands," and the weight of that knowledge settled into my bones, tightening my chest, constricting my breathing, making me feel simultaneously terrified and compulsively analytical. So once again, the letter and photographs had confirmed his absolute reach and obsessive control, and the realization that my mind had become the primary battleground for this psychological war made me both determined and terrified, because understanding it, predicting it, and maintaining vigilance were the only strategies I had to preserve even a fragment of safety, sanity, and control. And as I pored over the letters and photographs, comparing details, analyzing patterns, mapping timelines, and rehearsing potential responses, I recognized the relentless nature of his strategy, the patience, the adaptability, the obsessive focus on breaking down my sense of security, and I understood that even the smallest lapse in attention, the slightest distraction, could be exploited, turning ordinary life into an unpredictable, dangerous landscape. And as exhaustion, anxiety, and adrenaline combined, I realized that my existence had become a constant negotiation with fear, observation, and psychological dominance, a life in which vigilance, mental resilience, and the ability to anticipate his moves were the only tools I had. And even as I acknowledged this, I knew with chilling certainty that he would not relent, that the letters, the photographs, the observations, the subtle manipulations, and the reminders of his presence would continue to escalate, because this was not a temporary game, but a deliberate, patient, obsessive campaign designed to assert absolute control. And in that understanding, I felt both despair and grim determination, because surrender was impossible, and the only way to preserve even the smallest fragment of autonomy, safety, and sanity was to remain captivated, mentally resilient, endlessly vigilant, and endlessly observant in a world that had been irrevocably claimed by a man who had already proven that he could reach me anywhere, anytime, and manipulate my life with an obsessive precision that was as terrifying as it was absolute. And in that understanding, terrifying and exhausting as it was, I found the only path forward: to endure, to anticipate, to survive, and to remain ever mindful that my life, my thoughts, and my actions were no longer my own, but part of a carefully orchestrated web of psychological domination from which there could be no true escape. I had reached a state where my mind and body were constantly on edge, where every sound, every movement, every shadow seemed amplified, intensified, and loaded with potential meaning, because by this point, it was no longer simply about letters, photographs, or subtle intrusions into my apartment or workplace. Had become an unending, pervasive, living presence of fear and anticipation that infiltrated every corner of my life. Every thought I had, every glance I made, every decision I faced, and the psychological toll was immense, because the relentless vigilance I had been forced to maintain for weeks had begun to reshape my perception of reality, so that even the most ordinary moments felt fraught with danger. Every interaction could be manipulated, every observation was potentially recorded, and every routine step had the potential to be part of a carefully constructed, obsessive, manipulative pattern designed to assert dominance over me. And that day, as I left my apartment to take a short walk and grab a few necessary items, I found myself rehearsing every movement in my head, calculating possible lines of sight from windows, parked cars, and pedestrians, imagining the ways he could be observed, predicting and documenting me at every turn. And the intensity of that mental exercise was exhausting, because it demanded constant focus, constant awareness, and constant calculation. And even then, I knew it was never enough, because he had already proven with letters, photographs, and previous intrusions that he was patient, meticulous, and capable of observing me without my knowledge at any time, in any place. And as I moved along the street, every nerve in my body alert, I noticed a small envelope tucked into the corner of the mailbox, placed with deliberate care, and my hands trembled as I picked it up, because I knew immediately who it was from. And inside was a photograph taken from a distance, showing me walking across the street, and beneath it, a note that read, "Your every step is known. Your every action is mine to watch. You cannot escape," in the simplicity of the message, coupled with the precision of the photograph, sent a wave of panic coursing through me, tightening my chest, making my hands sweat, and setting my pulse racing, because it was undeniable proof that his reach had no limits, that he could observe me in real time in the physical world, and that every ordinary action could be exploited for his obsessive purposes. And yet, at the same time, there was a compulsion to analyze, to study, to dissect every detail of the letter and photograph, because understanding his methods was the only way to anticipate, survive, and maintain even a fragment of control. And as I continued on, my mind racing through contingency plans, possible escape routes, alternative strategies, I felt the crushing weight of the realization that my life had become a constant negotiation with fear, observation, and psychological manipulation. A life in which even the smallest lapse, the slightest distraction, could provide him an opportunity to assert dominance, to further invade, to increase control. And as I reached the store and performed my shopping with a hyper-aware, almost robotic attention to every detail, noticed yet another envelope placed strategically near the counter. Again, small, discreet, but impossible for me to ignore. And as I picked it up, my hands shaking, my mind spiraling with dread, I discovered inside a series of photographs documenting my journey to the store, from leaving my apartment to entering the building. The browsing the aisles, and beneath it, a note that read, "You think you are safe, but every step, every breath, every choice is mine to follow." And the impact of that message was visceral, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze my chest, tighten my muscles, and flood my mind with terror, because it was irrefutable proof of his obsessive surveillance and his patient, calculated dominance over my life. And as I left the store, clutching the envelope, scanning every reflection, every shadow, every passerby, I realized that my reality had been rewritten, transformed into a landscape of constant observation, psychological warfare, and relentless manipulation, where every corner, every room, every street, every interaction was potentially a tool for him to assert control. And even within the supposed safety of my apartment that night, I could not escape, because the letters, photographs, and notes had already invaded my mind, infiltrated my thoughts, and reshaped my perception of the world, so that every memory, every reflection, every interaction, even in the absence of physical evidence, was suffused with the knowledge that he was always there, always watching, always patient, always calculating. And the mental strain of maintaining hyper-awareness, analyzing patterns, predicting moves, and rehearsing contingency plans was overwhelming, because the psychological war had no end, no break, no relief. And each envelope, each photograph, each note confirmed that this was a patient, deliberate campaign designed to dominate, manipulate, and terrify. Kay, and as I reviewed the stack of correspondence that now dominated my apartment, Kay began to notice subtle details that revealed further layers of his obsession, variations in handwriting, timing of delivery, positioning of envelopes, angles of photographs, patterns that suggested he was learning, adapting, and evolving his methods based on my responses, my routines, and my increasing awareness. And that realization was both terrifying and compelling, because it meant that every mental exercise I performed, every strategy I devised, every precaution I took could already have been anticipated, calculated, and incorporated into his obsessive design. And the weight of that knowledge pressed down on me with a physical force, making it difficult to breathe, to think, to rest, and yet, paradoxically, also focus my mind, forcing me to analyze, to anticipate, to strategize, because surrendering to fear was not an option, and the only way to survive was to engage with the nightmare on his terms, to study, predict, and endure. And that night, as I sat amidst the growing pile of letters, photographs, and notes, pacing, scanning, analyzing, rehearsing, and imagining potential intrusions, I realized with bone-deep certainty that my life had been transformed into a labyrinth of observation, fear, and psychological domination, and that the only path forward, terrifying and exhausting as it was to remain hyper-aware, mentally resilient, and endlessly vigilant, because the man who had claimed my life had already proven that he could observe, manipulate, and dominate anywhere, anytime, and the knowledge that he could reach me at any moment, in any space, had become both my curse and my only weapon, because understanding, anticipating, and enduring were the only tools left to me in a world that he had meticulously rewritten in his image of obsession, control, and relentless, suffocating terror. And even as fear, exhaustion, and anxiety threatened to overwhelm me, I understood that surrender was impossible, and survival depended on continuing, enduring, and resisting the absolute psychological dominion he had established over my life, a dominion made real through letters, photographs, observation, and patient, obsessive calculation. And that understanding, terrifying as it was, became the axis around which my thoughts, decisions, and every waking moment now revolved, as the alternative was nothingness, complete erasure of autonomy, and the inescapable realization that my existence had been claimed in every way. That mattered by a man whose patience, obsession, and meticulous control knew no bounds. I had reached the brink of mental and physical exhaustion, state where every thought, every breath, every movement was consumed by the unrelenting presence of him. It's the man who had transformed my life into a labyrinth of fear, observation, and psychological domination, because over the preceding weeks, months, and countless hours of hyper-awareness, planning, analyzing, and enduring, I had come to understand the terrifying precision of his methods, the obsessive patience that allowed him to study, record, and manipulate every part of my life with a consistency and foresight that seemed almost inhuman. And yet, despite this, despite the overwhelming weight of terror pressing on me from every angle, part of me had developed a strange, grim determination to survive, to endure, to find some sliver of autonomy in a life that had been so thoroughly invaded, because I knew that surrender would mean losing everything, that capitulating to his psychological control would allow him to dominate my existence completely. And so, even as my body trembled, my mind raced, and my pulse hammered with anxiety, I forced myself to continue analyzing, anticipating, and calculating, mapping patterns in the letters, photographs, and notes he had sent, revisiting every movement, every interaction, every step I had taken in the past weeks, and looking for the faintest traces of predictability, the tiniest loopholes in his obsessive surveillance, as I understood that my only hope of reclaiming even a fragment of safety lay in my ability to understand him, to anticipate him, and to exploit the smallest weakness in his relentless pattern. And that morning came as I walked the streets with my senses heightened to the point of near painful awareness. I noticed subtle changes that had escaped me before a pedestrian lingering slightly too long. A car parked in the same spot I had observed previously. An angle of light reflecting differently off a window, and a chill ran through me because I knew instinctively that these were not coincidences, that every detail of my environment had been calculated to assert control, to communicate presence, to remind me that he was always watching. And as I continued, my mind raced through contingencies, escape routes, and hypothetical confrontations, weighing the risks of action against the suffocating certainty of observation. Because by this point, it was clear that he could reach me anywhere, anytime, and that ordinary life had become impossible, transformed into a stage for his obsession and my survival. And that evening, returning to my apartment, I found an envelope unlike any I had received before, heavier, more formal, sealed in a manner that suggested deliberate care. And as I opened it, my hands trembling, I found a series of photographs documenting not just my daily routines, but the interior of my apartment itself, taken with meticulous attention to angles, timing, and detail, and beneath them, a note that read simply, "I know everything. There's nowhere you can hide. Your life belongs to me, and you will learn what it means to live under my gaze," and the suffocating weight of those words, combined with the photographic evidence, pressed on me like a physical force, because it confirmed beyond doubt the absolute extent of his surveillance, the depth of his obsession, and the patient, methodical nature of his psychological domination. And I felt a combination of terror, exhaustion, and a perverse compulsion to study, analyze, and understand, because comprehension was the only weapon I had, the only strategy I could employ in the face of such relentless control. And I spent the hours that night pacing, scanning, comparing details, came rehearsing potential responses, mentally mapping his patterns, anticipating the timing of his next move, and searching desperately for even the smallest weakness in a web of obsession that seemed almost flawless. And as the days passed, I noticed increasingly subtle shifts in my environment, signs that he was escalating his methods, testing my reactions, serving my psychological state with a precision that both terrified and compelled me, because each small escalation was a calculated reminder of the control he wielded, and each response I rehearsed as a chance to reclaim some fragment of agency, even if only temporarily. And yet the strain was immense, leaving me sleepless, hyper alert and trapped in a cycle where vigilance and fear were inseparable. But every thought and action were measured against the backdrop of his presence. And one night, after what felt like an endless day of observation and mental calculation, I discovered another envelope slipped beneath my door. This one marked differently with careful, almost ceremonial handwriting, and inside I found a single photograph capturing me sleeping, taken with an angle that suggested prolonged observation. Okay? And beneath it, a note that read, "Even in rest, I am there. Even in dreams, I watch. You are mine to study." And the sheer intimacy and precision of the intrusion made my stomach churn, faint, my pulse spike, and my mind spin with panic and realization. Yes, this was no longer just surveillance, it was an invasion of the most private, vulnerable moments of life, for confirmation that my world had been claimed in every sense that mattered. And as I sat amidst the growing mountain of correspondence, photographs, and notes, I understood with bone-deep certainty that the psychological war he had waged against me had reached its apex, that every strategy I had devised, every precaution I had taken, every contingency I had planned was being tested, refined, and observed for effectiveness, and that my survival depended not just on vigilance, but on endurance, calculation, and the mental resilience that was being pushed to its absolute limit. And in the early hours of that night, as I stared at the photograph and note, a sudden clarity came over me, a grim understanding that the only way to reclaim some fraction of control was to anticipate him fully, to set traps of observation and misdirection, to take risks that were necessary to disrupt his pattern, because the psychological dominance he had established depended entirely on predictability. And if I could introduce uncertainty, hesitation, or misdirection, even briefly, it might provide a crack through which I could breathe, survive, and reclaim fragments of our time. And with that realization, I began planning meticulously, analyzing every past interaction, every detail in every letter, every photograph, every subtle manipulation, mapping potential counter moves and rehearsing them mentally, because the stakes were absolute. Success gave me a chance at survival, while error could solidify his control forever. And over the following hours, days, and nights, I executed a series of cautious, deliberate maneuvers designed to create uncertainty, to force him to react, to test the limits of his patience and observation, all the while documenting my own movements, recording anomalies, noting discrepancies, and studying responses, because in this final climactic phase of psychological warfare, my only weapon was intellect, strategy, and endurance. And as the tension mounted, the correspondence became more frequent, the photographs more precise, the notes more direct. Yet the subtle cracks in his pattern began to emerge. Small hesitations, inconsistencies, indications that even a patient, obsessive mind could be challenged. And with painstaking care, I exploited these cracks, creating opportunities for breathing, space, small moments of respite in a life that had otherwise been claimed entirely, and as days turned into nights, nights into sleepless stretches of observation, calculation, and strategy, I realized with both terror and grim determination that survival was possible, but only through relentless vigilance, unwavering focus, and the willingness to endure psychological siege that pushed the mind, body, and spirit to their absolute limits. And in that understanding, I found a paradoxical combination of fear, focus, and resolve, because while the terror of his obsession remained overwhelming, the knowledge that even the smallest exercise of strategy, anticipation, and careful manipulation could create a space for survival became my only anchor in a world that had been otherwise consumed by his meticulous, patient, obsessive domination. And as I sat amidst the mountain of correspondence, photographs, and notes, planning my next steps, calculating risks, and rehearsing contingencies, I understood with unshakable certainty that this battle was fought, and over with that through analysis, endurance, and careful strategy, I might yet retain a fragment of control in a life that he had claimed so completely, and that fragment became the axis of my existence, the foundation upon which every thought, every breath, and every decision revolved, because in a world dominated by fear, surveillance, and obsessive control, it was the only thing that could give me hope, strength, and a possibility of survival against a man who had proven that he could reach me anywhere, anytime, and dominate my life in ways that defied comprehension.